Insanity. Chapter 3. Defining Mental Illness. The subject of the following course of lectures will be the science of psychiatry, which, as its name implies, is that of the treatment of mental disease. It is true that, in the strictest terms, we cannot speak of the mind as becoming diseased. Emil Kraepelin. As physicians diagnose diseases of the body and treat medical patients, so psychiatrists diagnose diseases of the mind and treat mental patients. But what are mental diseases, and who are mental patients? How do bodily and mental diseases, medical and mental patients, resemble and differ from each other? In this chapter, I shall consider what constitutes mental illness. In other words, I shall examine and catalog the cognitive content of this idea. In examining the idea of mental illness, we must choose between two approaches and be clear about the premises built into each. One approach is to examine mental diseases as if they were bona fide, literal diseases. In this view, the class called illness comprises several subclasses, such as infectious diseases, metabolic diseases, autoimmune diseases, and mental diseases. The other approach is to examine mental diseases as if they were metaphorical diseases, that is, not diseases at all, but only bearing the names of diseases. In this view, the class called illness comprises bodily diseases only, and only bodily diseases are literal diseases. In order to present a clear and cogent, albeit critical account of what counts as mental illness, it is necessary, it seems to me, to go over this ground first from the conventional, currently accepted point of view, and treat mental illnesses as if they were illnesses. This is what I shall do in this chapter. In the next chapter, I shall present a similar analysis of the idea of being a mental patient. In a later chapter, I shall discuss mental illness as a metaphor. What counts as mental illness? Descriptions of mental illnesses as proven or putative brain diseases or as functional illnesses of the personality merely scratch the surface. After all, these are the two time-honored categories of mental illness, the organic and the functional. Max Hamilton, Nuffield Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Leeds, puts it this way. Mental illnesses. A. The functional psychoses. These are true illnesses in which a sharp break in the personality occurs, probably as a result of a neurophysiological disorder which so far has escaped detection. B. The organic states. These are true illnesses. These illnesses can be further classified as physical diseases. According to this view, both the functional and organic mental illnesses are physical diseases and true illnesses. Surely we can do better than this. Inasmuch as I devote several chapters to the most important meanings of mental illness, in this chapter I shall simply list and briefly explain its currently accepted criteria, Table 3.1. Table 3.1, Criteria of Mental Illness. Proven brain disease. Putative brain disease. A species of medical disorder, a treatable condition of brain or mind. Distress, disability, disadvantage, normality, unhappiness, suffering, commutability, non-intentionality, irrationality, irresponsibility, deviance and crime, other miscellaneous criteria. Mental illness as proven brain disease. The brain is an organ, and diseases of the brain manifest themselves inter alia as disturbances of behavior. Until as recently as the Second World War, mental hospitals were full of patients with brain diseases, mostly neurosyphilis. However, diseases of the brain are brain diseases. It is confusing, misleading, and unnecessary to call them mental illnesses. It is important to keep in mind, in this connection, that neurosyphilis, general paresis, is the historical paradigm of insanity. The fact that many insane persons turned out to suffer from brain diseases has imprinted itself indelibly on the collective memory of psychiatry. As a result, psychiatrists continue to look for the twisted molecule behind every twisted thought, and if they cannot find it today, they are confident they will find it tomorrow. Such faith in science, like faith in God, is unshakable, and it is foolish and unnecessary to try to shake it. Let it suffice to note here, then, that the most advanced thinking in psychiatry today again favors the view that mental illness is, quite simply, brain disease. Some say the brain disease is already proven, others that it remains to be proven. People who act crazy, explains Candence Pert, a psychiatric research scientist at the National Institute of Mental Health, are acting that way because they have too much or too little of some chemicals in their brains. It's just a physical illness. This message now reverberates not only through the halls of Congress, where it generates funds for research into mental illness, but also through the consciences of the relatives of mental patients, where, as we shall see later in chapters 9 and 10, it generates justifications are incarcerating the innocent and excusing the guilty. In a letter written in response to a newspaper article I wrote with two colleagues, a woman who identifies herself as the relative of a victim of schizophrenia, first charges me with closing my mind to the important research in biochemical psychiatry that has taken place in the last 10 years, and then articulates the mental illness is brain disease view as follows. There exists an abundance of biochemical and pathological evidence for establishing schizophrenic and affective disorders, for instance, as real illnesses. Doesn't Szasz recognize the brain can suffer from disease just as the lungs or the heart can suffer from disease? That is what is meant by saying that mental illness is like any other illness, something he criticizes other psychiatrists for saying. No doubt about it, this woman is well informed. Whether that makes her belief true is, of course, another matter. In 1981, the APA officially declared that schizophrenia is a biochemically based disease. In 1984, Frederick Goodwin, a leading research psychiatrist at the NIMH, asserted that the National Institute of Mental Health remains firmly committed to the overwhelming evidence indicating that chronic schizophrenia is a brain disease. Perhaps these gentlemen protest too much, however. Scientists at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute do not keep telling us that myocardial infarction is a heart disease. Scientists at the National Institute of Neurological and Communicative Diseases and Stroke do not keep telling us that stroke is a brain disease. So if the scientists at the NIMH are so sure that schizophrenia is a brain disease, why do they keep saying so, especially as that is just what its inventor-discoverer told us 74 years ago? And if schizophrenia is a brain disease, why do the scientists at the National Institute of Mental Health, rather than those at the National Institute of Neurological Diseases, tell us that? Lastly, I want to note here that although the claim that mental illness is a brain disease is now touted as if it were a new idea based on and supported by recent medical discoveries, this is not the case. For example, in 1901, the president of the American Medico-Psychological Association spoke glowingly about how the insane emerged from darkness into light, from demonism to human beings afflicted with bodily disease. More recently, Linus Pauling, one of the foremost scientists of our age and the winner of 2 Nobel Prizes, asserted, "I believe that mental diseases are molecular diseases, the result of a biochemical abnormality in the human body." Most people may find it a daunting prospect to contemplate that such intellectual and scientific giants could be wrong. However, they might be wrong. It has happened before, and I think is happening again. Mental illness as putative brain disease. This is the same view as described above, the sole difference between the two being that the proponents of the idea that mental illness is a putative brain disease usually express themselves in slightly more restrained terms. For example, Seymour Keedy states, "Our ability to demonstrate and elucidate pathological disturbances is limited by the state of the art, and to assume their absence because they have not been demonstrated is a non sequitur. To assume their presence because they have not been demonstrated is, I presume, Keedy's idea of displaying the proper psychiatric scientific attitude." Keedy then cites Henry Maudsley's classic, The Physiology and Pathology of Mind, 1872, as a refutation of Szasz and Lang before they were born. At present, we know nothing whatever of the intimate constitution of nerve element and of the mode of its functional action, and it is beyond doubt that important molecular and chemical changes may take place in those inner recesses to which we have not yet gained access. Where the subtlety of nature so far exceeds the subtlety of human investigation, to conclude from the non-appearance of change to the non-existence thereon could be just as if the blind man were to maintain there were no colors, or the deaf to assert there is no sound. True enough. But I do not maintain that the non-existence of pathological findings in schizophrenia proves there are none. I maintain only that a promise of such findings is only a promise until it is fulfilled. More than a century has passed since Maudsley issued his promissory note. It is still unredeemed. If psychiatrists had to pay interest on their promises of pathological lesions, as borrowers must to lenders, the interest alone would have already bankrupted them. Instead, they keep reissuing the same notes, undaunted by their perfect record of never meeting their obligations. Here is another example of mental illness defined as a putative brain disease, offered by Samuel B. Goose, professor of psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis. Eventually, we may well discover that idiopathic mental illness indeed involves subtle physiological abnormalities that have so far eluded us. In view of the relatively unsophisticated state of our understanding of neurophysiology and neuropathology, it is more than likely that there are diseases of the human brain, just as there are diseases of the human immune system that have not yet been discovered. However, ordinary honesty, not to mention scientific integrity, requires that we distinguish between proven and putative diseases, lest we discover diseases by fantasy and fiat, as we do when we attach disease labels to disapproved behaviors, such as gambling. Mental disorder as a species of medical disorder. For a long time, psychiatrists have viewed mental disease on the model of medical disease, which, in turn, meant a somatic lesion understood both in an anatomical and physiological sense. Implicitly, that is, judging from the character of psychiatric research and the emphasis on drug treatment, they still view it as a somatic lesion. But in their explicit definition of mental illness, psychiatrists have made a fundamental switch which has failed to receive the attention it deserves. Perhaps because they have been unable to demonstrate a somatic basis for mental illness, or perhaps because they realize that the idea of mental disease is basically unrelated to the idea of the body as a machine, psychiatrists have changed their basic criterion and tactic for defining mental illness. First, they define illness as a genus. Then, having created a suitably elastic category of illness, they define mental illness as a member of the genus called illness. This is precisely what Robert Spitzer, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and the moving spirit behind DSM-3, does by offering this definition of mental illness, now called disorder. A mental disorder is a medical disorder. So much for that. Having placed mental illness where he wants to find it, Spitzer continues, "A medical disorder is a relatively distinct condition resulting from an organismic dysfunction which in its fully developed or extreme form is directly and intrinsically associated with distress, disability, or certain other types of disadvantage. The disadvantage may be of a physical, perceptual, sexual, or interpersonal nature. Implicitly, there is a call for action on the part of the person who has the condition, the medical or its allied professions, and society. It is unlikely that any dermatologist, surgeon, or pathologist would take this definition seriously, or for that matter, that anyone could or would want to defend it on intellectual or scientific grounds. However, this definition is clearly defensible as useful indeed, perhaps now as necessary, for legitimizing the feverish medicalization of modern life, an endeavor whose value psychiatrists seem not to question. To the man who wants to use a hammer badly, observed Mark Twain, a lot of things look like nails that need hammering. To doctors, politicians, and the public today, a lot of things look like diseases that need treatment. Some of these things Spitzer classifies as mental diseases, disorders. A mental disorder, he writes, is a medical disorder whose manifestations are primarily signs or symptoms of a psychological, behavioral nature, or if physical, can be understood only using psychological concepts. Donald F. Klein, a colleague of Spitzer's at Columbia, hammers home this tautology with the finesse of a pile driver. By mental illness, he declares, we mean a subset of all illnesses. This certainly makes it easy for the psychiatrist to prove that mental illness is an illness, and that the psychiatrist is a medical specialist. It is all accomplished by fiat. See Figure 3.1. Mental illness as a treatable condition. Psychiatrists now often claim that a particular form of behavior is a mental illness because, as they put it, it responds to psychiatric treatment. This perspective, too, implies a radical change in criterion, from lesion to intervention, from a medical to a criminological model of illness. Figure 3.1. Mental illness as literal disease. A equals illness, any condition called and officially recognized as a disease. B. Mental illness, any condition called and officially recognized as a mental disease. Actually, it is not unreasonable to define crime from such a cart before the horse point of view, that is, as what legislators prohibit and judges and juries punish. Psychiatrists now propose the same perspective for mental illness. A mental disorder is what psychiatrists so identify and use drugs to treat. For example, Morris Upton, a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina, states, "There is good reason to believe that neurotransmitters and their receptors are involved in mental illness because pharmacological manipulations of these are our most powerful methods for treating the illness." There is, of course, method in the madness of defining disease in terms of what doctors do to it. In the process, psychiatrists conceal the traditionally coercive paternalistic perspective on treatment characteristic of psychiatry. In other words, this definition doubles as a disguised defense of a policy of psychiatrists treating diseases rather than patients, and of consent to psychiatric treatment being either irrelevant or more easily obtained from sane surrogates than insane patients. The following example, from a Natter Group report on the homeless mentally ill in Washington, D.C., is illustrative. It is important to stress that schizophrenia is a treatable disease in the majority of cases. It is therefore remarkable that a situation is tolerated in which most of the approximately 1 in 200 persons with a treatable disease live untreated on the streets and in shelters. Imagine the outcry if 1,200 untreated diabetics were living on the streets and in shelters. This is a characteristically selective use of the disease analogy. Because schizophrenia is a disease like diabetes, schizophrenics, we are admonished, should not go untreated. What the authors neglect to mention is that most diabetics are not children. They are adults responsible for securing their own treatment for their own illness. Only exceptionally is a diabetic treated without his consent, and virtually never is he treated against his will. If one were to develop the analogy between diabetes and schizophrenia fully and fairly, one would have to say, and say just as indignantly, imagine the outcry if 1,200 untreated diabetics were incarcerated in asylums for diabetics and subjected to involuntary treatment. It must be noted, finally, that not only is treatability not a legitimate criterion of illness, but that psychiatrists and their acolytes use the idea in a thoroughly debauched way. They simply ascribe what they call treatability to any form of behavior they want to coercively control. One typical current example should suffice. Is taking illegal drugs an illness? Of course, says Tory Brown, medical consultant to the National Basketball Association. Why does Brown believe this? Because it's something that needs treatment, is treatable, and you can recover from it. Perhaps the time has come to expunge the names of Ignaz Semmelweis, Paul Ehrlich, and Robert Koch from the annals of the history of medicine. For if the criterion of what constitutes disease is what Tory Brown and all those who agree with him say it is, then what the pioneers of modern medicine studied and the diseases and treatments they discovered had nothing to do with what we now regard as some of our most important and serious diseases. Actually, the idea of treatability as a criterion of illness represents a perversely ironic inversion of what, until recently, characterized most serious diseases and still characterizes many, namely, untreatability. It would be folly to forget that the scientific concept of illness, developed in the 19th century and still accepted as its literal meaning, has nothing whatever to do with treatability. Bacterial endocarditis was untreatable when I was a medical student and is treatable today. It was a disease then and is a disease now. The psychiatrist's current emphasis on treatability is especially perverse. Schizophrenia, Jung reminds us in his autobiography, was considered incurable in the early decades of this century. If one did achieve some improvement with a case of schizophrenia, the answer was that it had not been real schizophrenia. Jung was an honest man, and he rejected psychiatry as a dishonest enterprise. Today, psychiatry is an even more dishonest enterprise than it was then. The contemporary psychiatric definition of mental illness as a treatable condition reeks of a foul combination of arrogance and stupidity. Distress, disability, disadvantage. These 3 Ds, as Spitzer calls them, are the cardinal criteria of mental illness underlying DSM-3. All 3 must be present for a condition officially to qualify as a mental illness. As we shall see, it is easy to juggle them so that one or more are present or absent as the classifier desires. Consider first distress, defined thus. This means that either the subject complains about the distress that he experiences or distress is inferred from his manifest behavior. Regrettably, the word inferred here means, as the history of psychiatry shows, that the psychiatrist can attribute distress to anything and everything he wants to. For example, he may infer distress from smoking and not being able to stop, or from being able to stop but wishing to smoke. Nor must we forget, in this connection, that most odious of psychiatric inferences, namely, interpreting the affect of a person who brags about being Jesus or who feels high for whatever reason, as distress. The second criterion, disability, is equally elastic and meaningless. By disability, Spitzer means that there is impairment in more than one area of functioning. To illustrate this criterion, Spitzer offers the following example. As a consequence of the requirement of generalized impairment, it is possible for a condition to be associated with impairment in a single function and not be classified as a disorder, providing that the condition does not result in any of the other 2 Ds, distress, disadvantage. Thus, homosexuality per se, which represents an impairment in functioning in the area of heterosexual relationships, is not considered a mental disorder because the area of impairment is often limited, and this condition does not qualify for either of the other Ds, as we have defined them. The third D, disadvantage, must, according to Spitzer, be a disadvantage not resulting from the above 2 Ds. Surely, this is also absurd that no one would pay attention to it were it not for the powers inherent in and the social consequences of the APA's official nomenclature of mental diseases. Normality, suffering, unhappiness. As satire, the idea that everyone is mentally ill occurs already in 19th century Bell's letters. It remained for Freud to take this idea seriously. Thus, states Freud in his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, a healthy person, too, is virtually a neurotic. Asserting that health is illness is base rhetoric at its most brazen, which is why, elsewhere, I have characterized Freud as a base rhetorician. Kenneth Minogue, a professor of political science at the London School of Economics, views this intellectual style as characteristic of the ideologist who resembles Sigmund Freud in thinking it is always the pathological that reveals the character of the ordinary. Of course, Freud was following the footsteps of some distinguished ideologists and base rhetoricians who had pioneered the tactic of conceptual and moral inversion long before Orwell dreamt of it. Proudhon, for example, is remembered for asserting that property is theft, a dictum warmly embraced by socialists and communists. Freud's dictum has similarly been embraced by psychoanalysts. For example, an acolyte in New York writes, "The normal character disorder is a fairly well-recognized disease. One wonders if insurance underwriters have any idea of what lurks in the minds of the soul doctors." It should be kept in mind that before the Freudian Revolution, the psychiatrist was a physician who worked in a mental hospital, typically a public insane asylum, and that being categorized as insane meant being treated as a fit subject for psychiatric incarceration. For a marvelously entertaining and instructive spoof of what happens when a psychiatrist begins to view everyone around him as crazy, see the classic short story, The Psychiatrist, by the 19th century Brazilian physician-writer Machado de Assis. The universality of mental illness implicit in this line of thinking was given its imprimatur by a study that, in its day, was hailed as the most important post-World War II inquiry into the nature and epidemiology of mental illness. In Current Concepts of Positive Mental Health, the book that became the Bible of the community mental health movement, Marie Jahoda writes, "If it is reasonable to assume that such human conflicts are universal, we are all sick in different degrees. Actually, the differences between anyone and a psychotic may lie in the way he handles his conflicts. Apart from extremes, there is no agreement on the types of behavior which it is reasonable to call sick. Karl Menninger agrees. In The Vital Balance, he writes, "We say that all people have mental illness of different degrees at different times, and that sometimes some are much worse or better. And this is precisely what recent epidemiological studies have demonstrated. Gone forever is the notion that the mentally ill person is an exception. It is now accepted that most people have some degree of mental illness at some time." Menninger's view that everyone is mentally ill has now made its way into the very heart of the official diagnostic system of American psychiatry. In court testimony, under oath, Jay Katz, a professor of psychiatry at Yale, admitted that if you look at DSM-3, you can classify all of us under one rubric or another of mental disorder. Does this make Katz reject mental illness as a valid medical diagnosis? Of course not. The importance of all-inclusiveness as a characteristic of the criterion of mental illness will become clear when we consider its strategic uses. See Chapter 9. Since suffering is a universal human experience, the view that everyone has mental illness may be bracketed with the view that suffering is a criterion of mental illness. Indeed, according to Menninger, who espouses this view, suffering is a criterion of all illness, not just of mental illness. He writes, "We can define illness as being a certain state of existence which is uncomfortable to someone and for which medical science offers or is believed by the public to offer relief. The suffering may be in the afflicted person or in those around him, or both." Lest this definition be dismissed as that of a crank, it must be remembered that Karl Menninger was the undisputed dean of post-World War II American psychiatry. Finally, the idea of unhappiness with one's own lot as a criterion of illness is now supported not only by psychiatrists, but also by members of so-called minority groups with special axes of their own to grind, such as women and homosexuals. For example, is pregnancy a disease or homosexuality? Abstractly, pregnancy is not considered to be a disease, but concretely, unwanted pregnancy, that is, unwanted by the woman who is pregnant, is. Similarly, homosexuality as such is not considered to be a mental illness, but ego-dystonic homosexuality, that is, homosexuality unwanted by the subject, is. Some of these definitions may seem especially compassionate or humane, as they appear to respect the subject's wishes concerning whether or not she or he wishes to be treated as ill. But this is a dangerous illusion. Physicians continue to define disease independently of whether the subject is or is not satisfied with his condition. They regard a person suffering from, say, diabetes or leukemia as ill, regardless of whether or not the patient is satisfied with having diabetes or leukemia, or even recognizes himself as having an illness. Similarly, psychiatrists define persons exhibiting what they call schizophrenia or mania as ill, even though such persons typically insist they are not ill and reject psychiatric help. Psychiatrists say that such patients deny their illness. Nor have psychiatrists really given up on homosexuality. According to Donald Klein, if an obligate homosexual becomes unhappy with his lot, tries to perform heterosexually and cannot, he thereby demonstrates operationally an intrinsic involuntary incapacity sufficient to elicit social concern, should be considered ill, and is entitled to the sick role. But suppose the homosexual is happy. Klein is not willing to declare him mentally healthy. The happy homosexual may be suspected of underlying disease, but currently the issue is moot. Is there anyone who may not be suspected of underlying disease, especially by psychiatrists? Mental illness as commutability. Precisely because there is no objectively verifiable criterion like a blood test or biopsy for ascertaining whether or not a person is mentally ill, the presence of this illness is often, and characteristically, inferred from the fact that the supposedly mentally ill person occupies the role of mental patient. This is the reason why persons who assume the role of mental patient, by asserting that they are mentally ill or seeking admission to a mental hospital, as well as those to whom the role is ascribed against their will by commitment to a mental hospital, are all viewed as mentally ill. This is also the reason why many official forms, such as applications for employment, driver's license, license to carry a gun, Ask whether the applicant has ever been a patient in a mental hospital. If the person answers yes, there is no way he can ever prove that he was not mentally ill. Moreover, an affirmative answer creates the presumption that he is still mentally ill, a presumption the subject might find difficult to overcome. The fact that the presence of mental illness is typically inferred from the suspected subject's occupancy of the role of mental patient gives rise not only to circular definitions of the condition, but also to purely dispositional definitions of it, masquerading as descriptions. For example, in 1954, the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, GAP, an organization of leading American psychiatrists, proposed the following definition of mental illness. Mental illness shall mean an illness which so lessens the capacity of a person to maintain his judgment as to warrant his commitment to a mental institution. This idea may now seem antiquated, because according to the present rules of forensic psychiatry, a person cannot be committed for mental illness alone. He must also be dangerous to himself or others. This is another reminder of the fact that it is quite impossible to understand mental illness without knowing a good deal about its history, that is, about the changing fashions in psychiatric rhetoric and mental health policy. Commutability as a criterion of mental illness illustrates most dramatically the dissimilarities between bodily illness and mental illness, and the similarities between crime and mental illness, the latter two being identified, in part, by their consequences: incarceration in prison in case of felony, in a mental hospital in case of folly. The semantics of psychiatry also points to and reveals an intimate connection between insanity and incarceration. For about 2 centuries, from 1700 until 1900, the only persons regarded as suffering from a bona fide mental illness were patients legally classified as mad, usually called certified lunatics. Although the adjective certifiable as applied to mental patients has an increasingly old-fashioned ring to it, laymen, reporters, and even legal writers sometimes still use terms such as certifiable madman or certifiably insane. We must remember, too, that during the 18th and 19th centuries, the institution in which mental patients were housed were called lunatic asylums, not mental hospitals. The persons who did the confining were called alienists or mad doctors, not psychiatrists, and the persons confined were committed to the asylums by law, like criminals to prison. Thus, before about 1900, the term voluntary mental patient would have been an oxymoron, just as the term voluntary convict would be now. In other words, the idea of mental illness as a condition is inextricably tied to the idea of being a mental patient as a social role. Further, the social role of mental patient in turn derives from and rests on a legal definition or imposition of a particular social status. Mental illness as non-intentionally, the belief that the mentally ill person cannot form intent, that his behavior is unintended, like a reflex, plays an important part in the idea of mental illness, especially in its legal applications. The belief that the mentally ill person is a passive victim of compulsions, irresistible impulses, or unconscious forces is a closely related notion. The image of the insane person as someone not really himself, that is, as someone who engages in behavior he does not really intend, is very old. Building on it, Freud claimed that there are 2 kinds of mental states and behaviors, conscious and unconscious, and that mental symptoms are unconsciously motivated or determined. This combined psychiatric psychoanalytic imagery sustains the present view that the behavior of mentally ill persons is, or may be, unintended, and that non-intentionality is one of the criteria of mental illness. The following scenario, taken from a newspaper story, illustrates this use of the idea of non-intentionality in psychiatry. Stephen Smith, fictitious name, a hospital technician, complains of being unable to walk or see and is diagnosed as suffering from multiple sclerosis. Confined to a wheelchair for 4 years, he receives more than $40,000 in Social Security disability benefits. During church service one day, he gets out of his wheelchair and declares, "It's not a miracle that I'm standing here." Smith tells the astonished audience that he had been faking his symptoms, adding, "I could have claimed a miraculous recovery and everything would have been fine, but that wouldn't have helped my problem." The minister, the Reverend T. Jones, fictitious name, hastens to explain to the congregation that he, Smith, did not do this intentionally. He said he, Smith, was planning to seek psychological care to find out why he did it, emphasis added. By viewing Smith's malingering sustained over a period of more than 4 years as non-intentional, Smith himself, the minister of his church, and the congregation could all conclude that Smith was mentally ill and that his behavior was the result of mental illness. Had Smith's behavior been viewed as deliberately contrived, his minister and the congregation would have had to conclude that Smith was a sinner rather than a sick person. Indeed, so basic is the idea of non-intentionality to the legal concept of insanity that it is often listed as its indispensable pathognomonic characteristic. For example, Benjamin Gresham, an attorney, states, "The lunatic is, by definition, subject to a disease that creates forces beyond his control. The lunatic is regarded as unable to form intent," emphasis added. As I shall show later, this is patently untrue, see Chapter 7. However, it is precisely because this contention is false that it is so useful as a legal and scientific fiction. Consider in this connection the current view of alcoholism as a disease and the curious role of intentionality in it. The now fashionable psychiatric popular view of alcoholism exhibits a revealing doublethink and double talk. Asserting that alcoholism is a disease like diabetes, the advocates of this view add that blaming the alcoholic for his alcoholism is therefore just as mistaken and mischievous as would be blaming the diabetic for his diabetes, and that intentionality or willpower has nothing to do with getting well. Working the analogy for all it's worth, the propagandists assert that the alcoholic can no more intend or will to get over his disease than can the diabetic. On the other hand, the proponents of this view contend that in order to get over his disease, the alcoholic must abstain from drinking alcohol. But not drinking is an act of abstinence that only the alcoholic can intend or perform. This doublethink is nicely conveyed in the following letter written to Dear Abby, which she brings to us with her enthusiastic agreement. The American Medical Association does classify alcoholism as a disease. There is documented research showing that alcoholics have a different physiological makeup than non-alcoholics. Their enzymes, genes, hormones, and brain chemistry work together to create their abnormal reaction to alcohol. And yes, it is a genetic disease. It must be wonderful to know all this without having had to go to medical school. The writer and Dear Abby also know how to treat this disease. The alcoholic is never cured, but by abstaining from alcohol one day at a time, he can escape the hell of compulsive drinking. So, after telling us that alcoholism is a disease, the writer suddenly says, it is hell. Perhaps he and Dear Abby and a few other people are a little mixed up about what is a bodily disease, what is a mental disease, and what is hell. Are these 3 different things, or are they only 3 different names for the same thing? Mental illness as irrationality. The view that the insane person is irrational, and vice versa, is as old as the idea of mental illness itself. Often, the 2 terms are used synonymously. Nowadays, psychiatrists like to emphasize that the mentally ill person is sick, whereas lawyers like to emphasize that he is irrational. Thus, there is an interesting difference between them with respect to where, in the anatomy of madness, each locates the lesion. Psychiatrists, typically, say that mental illness is a disease because it is a proven or putative brain disease manifested by mental symptoms, whereas lawyers often say that mental illness is a disease because it is irrationality manifested by mental symptoms. This legal perspective on mental illness is most forcefully articulated by Herbert Fingaret, a professor of philosophy at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Insanity, mental illness, mental disease, these are not medical concepts, he asserts. While that may sound as if Fingaret were zeroing in on the metaphorical character of the idea of mental illness, nothing could be further from the truth. Fingaret wants to legitimize, not delegitimize, the psychiatrist's authority based on the idea of insanity, as the following excerpt shows. Who are the insane? The insane are madmen, crazy persons bereft of reason. They are persons whose conduct is irrational because they themselves are irrational persons. To those who have observed an insane person, it is evident. But surely, we can observe an insane person only when we know he is insane. And how do we know that? Fingeret's voluminous writings on the subject leave no doubt that he regards the psychiatrist as the proper expert to tell us. Since Fingeret wants to legitimize the notion of insanity, he fills it with the content that would do so most convincingly for philosophers and other devotees of pure reason, namely, irrationality. There is a notion which lies at the heart of the idea of insanity. It is irrationality. Having seized upon the notion of irrationality, we have grasped what is the most distinctive element in insanity. Mental health and mental illness are thus categories rooted in the spiritual. Both the mentally healthy and the mentally ill suffer, but the suffering of the mentally ill is rooted in irrationality. The mind that is ill is the mind that is irrational. Clearly, Fingeret uses the term mental illness as an analog to bodily illness. Since he maintains that the mentally ill person is not responsible for his criminal acts and should be incarcerated by psychiatrists, it is equally clear that he uses the term mental illness as a literalized metaphor to serve the traditional purposes of institutional psychiatry. Rationality is mental health, concludes Fingeret. Why not piety, or obedience to authority, or social adjustment? Yet, Fingeret's interpretation is by no means idiosyncratic. For example, Michael S. Moore, a professor of law at the University of Southern California, carries the idea of insanity as irrationality even further, reaching the most astonishing conclusions about the humanity of the human beings he calls mentally ill. We predicate mentally ill of a person whenever we find his past behavior unintelligible in some fundamental way. When is there this fundamental failure of understanding of a fellow human being? The answer lies in those attributes that allow us to see another member of the human species as a person, that is, having the attributes of autonomy and rationality. It is the lack of rationality that prevents us from understanding mentally ill human beings to the same extent that we understand more normal persons. Being mentally ill means being incapacitated from acting rationally in this fundamental sense. The difficulties this definition poses are obvious. In the first place, it puts a premium on the observer's inability to understand another person. What Moore neglects to mention, moreover, is that it is not enough for A to be unable to understand B's behavior in order to be able to declare B irrational and insane. A must also have more power than B. Specifically, A must have the power to place B in a legal and social category in which B does not want to be. Actually, if this definition were taken seriously, whenever A does not understand B, A could conclude that B is irrational, and who would be judging A's rationality? The parochial nature of this perspective is obvious. After all, we know that there are several categories of human beings whose behavior normal adults often find difficult or impossible to understand. For example, small children and foreigners. Are they to be judged irrational and insane? The ancient Greeks believed that anyone who did not speak Greek was a barbarian, and misogynic men now believe that all women are crazy. It is wonderfully revealing of the nature of psychiatry that whereas in natural science there is a premium on the expert observer's ability to understand what he observes, and to understand it better than the object he observes, which is typically inanimate, in psychiatry there is a premium on the expert's inability to understand what he observes, and to understand it less well than the object he observes, which is typically another person eager to proffer his own understanding of his own behavior. The psychological advantages of not understanding human behavior is, of course, a subject amply illuminated by both writers and psychologists. Its strategic, economic, political, and social advantages are explored in detail in the present volume. Mental illness as irresponsibility. The connections between insanity and irresponsibility and between insanity and irrationality are similar. Historically, insanity was synonymous with irresponsibility. Juries, Moore observes, have always perceived that madness itself precludes responsibility. Of course, since that is the way madness is defined. Moore also alludes to mankind's intuitive judgment that mentally ill human beings are not responsible. Of course, if paternalism is accepted as the natural state of human affairs. Indeed, The time-honored prejudice about the non-responsibility of the insane is enshrined in the various formulations of the insanity defense. The once famous and now infamous Durham Rule puts it this way: an accused is not criminally responsible if his unlawful act was the product of mental disease. For further discussion, see especially Chapter 8. Mental illness as deviance and crime. The commission of certain sensational crimes has long been equated with insanity. This equation is asserted more strongly today than ever before in history, and more strongly in the United States than anywhere else in the world. For example, if a mother murders her young children, or if a street person pushes a waiting passenger to his death under a subway train, there is an automatic assumption that the murderer is mentally ill. When such a case comes to trial, the prosecutor rarely objects to the psychiatric exculpation of the criminal's conduct and is satisfied if the culprit is committed to a mental hospital. Curiously, this conflating of the ideas of illegality, immorality, and insanity is now considered to be scientific. For example, according to James Marshall, a legal scholar, a history of unconventional behavior, of deviance from social norms, may indicate mental illness. Jesus, Luther, the Founding Fathers, Lenin, Hitler, and Martin Luther King, to mention only a few historical figures, have all violated social norms and engaged in unconventional behavior. Did they all have a mental illness? The positivistic psychiatric understanding of mental illness as social deviance stands condemned by its utter insensitivity to ethical and political issues. Other miscellaneous criteria and concepts of mental illness. Although the criteria and concepts that lead psychiatrists and others to conclude that a particular behavior counts as a mental illness already listed are long enough, by no means do they encompass all of the odd suggestions that have been advanced in the psychiatric quest for the holy grail of defining this elusive condition. For example, in an essay purportedly presenting a philosophical analysis of the idea of mental illness, Marshall Edelson, a professor of psychiatry at Yale, defines mental illness as the morbid process and the effects of attempts to recover from it, initiated by some degree and duration of frustration of a wish to attain a symbolized, desirable state of affairs that remains unmitigated by adaptive mastery of external reality, substitution, or sublimation. Insofar as Edelson's statement makes sense at all, it offers an astonishingly silly criterion for mental illness. For what has a process initiated by a frustrated wish got to do with illness? The word process, a vacuous abstraction, functions here simply as a semantic prop, enabling the author to attach to it the adjective morbid, thus creating a disease by word magic, pure and simple. The idea that a frustrated wish causes a morbid process, which in turn constitutes a mental illness, is preposterous, philosophically as well as practically. On the basis of this criterion, there is no human action that could not be interpreted as a mental illness. For example, suppose that a poor person, despairing over his prospects of ever earning a sizable amount of money, robs a bank. This action is motivated, in part at least, by a frustrated wish. Therefore, it is a symptom of a mental illness. That way surely lies madness, but we now call it psychiatry. Although in a contest for psychiatric obscurantism, it would be difficult to decide who deserves first prize, this pellucid pronouncement by Judd Marmor, emeritus professor of psychiatry at the University of Southern California, must, like Edelson's, be counted as a formidable entrant. An awareness of the pluralistic, multifactorial origins of psychopathology broadens our understanding and increases our therapeutic potential. The psychiatrist who thinks in systemic terms is a true generalist in medicine. Most psychiatric propagandists are satisfied with claiming that mental illness is a bona fide illness and that the psychiatrist is therefore a bona fide medical specialist. Marmor goes one giant step further. He claims that the psychiatrist is a true generalist in medicine. But would anyone in his right mind ask a psychiatrist to remove his inflamed appendix or his ingrown toenail, for that matter? Mental patients have been diagnosed as having delusions of grandeur for less. Since human beings are known to be creatures of habit, experts intent on inflating the concept of mental illness have also proposed repetitiveness, especially if the repetitive behavior is undesirable, as a criterion of mental illness. The best clinical evidence of kleptomania or pyromania, pontificates James Marshall, is the very repetitive character of the deviance. Spitzer, too, likes this criterion. Two distinct conditions which have been identified and which will be included in DSM-3 on this basis are kleptomania and pyromania. Certainly, the incomprehensibility of these conditions to the untrained observer is further support for viewing these conditions as evidence of an organismic dysfunction. The psychiatrist's eagerness to find mental illness wherever he looks is matched only by his reluctance to define mental illness. Thus, while some respected psychiatric authorities insist that at least 1/4 of the American population suffers from identifiable mental illness, or that sometime in their lives everyone is mentally ill, others tell us that mental illness simply cannot be defined. Lawrence C. Kolb, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons and the author of the classic Noyes Modern Clinical Psychiatry, writes, "Since all behavior is but a reaction to personality and life factors, it is not always easy to define criteria of mental illnesses. An unbroken line of continuity exists from normal behavior to neurotic and psychotic behavior. Perhaps the criteria of mental illness are largely the degree to which behavior becomes undesirably substitutive and symbolic, and the extent to which problems are dealt with in a neurotic manner rather than by rational decision." Since this was written, 1968, the term neurosis has been eliminated from the official diagnostic vocabulary of psychiatry, but the definition of mental illness, a term that has also been purged, has not become any more precise. In DSM-3, mental illness is replaced by mental disorder, which is defined as follows. Although this manual provides a classification of mental disorders, there is no satisfactory definition that specifies precise boundaries for the concept mental disorder, also true for such concepts as physical disorder and mental and physical health. In DSM-3, each of the mental disorders is conceptualized as a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is typically associated with either a painful symptom, distress, or impairment in one or more important areas of functioning, disability. The authors of DSM-3 are of course wrong when they assert that there is no satisfactory definition of physical disorder. Most bodily illnesses, for example, arthritis, arteriosclerosis, hypertension, myocardial infarction, tuberculosis, syphilis, mumps, measles, poliomyelitis, malignant melanoma, subdural hematoma, need one go on, are clearly defined and can be objectively and reliably identified. The assertion that physicians have the same difficulty defining medical diseases as psychiatrists have defining mental diseases is false. The rest of this passage, with its plethora of semantic pretensions, exemplified by the terms clinically significant, syndrome, distress, and disability that do the work of code words, is reminiscent of Edelson's obscurantism. In short, the authors of DSM-3 offer us a definition of mental disorder so obscure and all-inclusive as to be meaningless. Although modern existential or so-called will psychologists like to emphasize their disagreements with the deterministic philosophy underlying psychiatry and psychoanalysis, they too love the ideas of mental health and mental illness, which they define in accordance with their own concepts of virtue and wickedness. Thus, to Colin Wilson, schizophrenia is a disorder in which the robot takes over from the T. Enamored with Abraham Maslow's idea of peak experience, which, I fear, is merely another pretentious way of talking about living life to the fullest, Wilson latches on to the absence of such experiences as a criterion of mental illness. It would not be inaccurate to say, he writes, that we are mentally ill all the time, we are not having peak experiences. This is going from the medical model of mental illness to what we might dub the artistic model of it. Everyone who is not creative, whatever that might mean, is mentally sick. Under the band-aid of existential rhetoric, there remains the festering old sore of mental illness. This survey of the current criteria of mental illness would be incomplete without mentioning religiosity as psychopathology. A good deal of the voluminous literature on this subject is devoted to showing that religion is a cause or symptom of mental illness. For example, Eli S. Chesson, a psychiatrist and author of a book revealingly titled "Religion May Be Hazardous to Your Health," writes, Religion is actually a kind of a consumer good that is without question potentially harmful to the user's mental health. I am not espousing atheism or any other religious stance. I am merely setting down a series of conclusions based upon the observations of case histories. There is a common, close association between religion and psychotic disorders. There is absolutely no question in my mind that many ultra-fundamentalist preachers are themselves suffering from a schizophrenic psychosis, acting on the proposition that a certain kind of religiosity is a mental illness. Richard Yao, a former Wall Street lawyer, has founded an organization he calls Fundamentalists Anonymous. The best-kept secret in America, he contends, is that fundamentalism could be a serious health hazard to millions. By health hazard, Yao, of course, means mental health hazard. Fundamentalism, he says, causes a disease of the mind that should be taken seriously. But all is not lost. M. Scott Peck, a psychiatrist, an avowed born-again Christian, and a best-selling author, has discovered that mental illness is due to demonic possession. Describing himself as the highest-paid shrink in the world, Peck claims to have twice encountered Satan and predicts that within a decade, demonic possession will be a psychiatric diagnosis, evidently subscribing to the principle that if a person is going to reinvent the wheel, he might as well go back to the original model. He enjoins us to recombine the concepts of illness, mental illness, and God's will as they used to be united in the good old days. Mental illness, Peck explains, occurs when the conscious will of the individual deviates substantially from the will of God. Finally, I want to mention one more criterion of mental illness, namely rhetorical power justifying the claim that the psychiatrist is a bona fide physician. The content of this claim changes with changing fashions in medicine and psychiatry, as the following reflections illustrate. When I was a young psychiatrist, my colleagues rationalized their medical pretensions by claiming that unconscious conflicts in the human mind caused bodily diseases. The medical value of psychoanalysis thus lay in discovering and demonstrating the supposedly psychiatric etiology of bodily diseases, such as asthma, peptic ulcer, or ulcerative colitis, and in promising to cure them by means of psychotherapy. Accordingly, the magic phrases justifying the psychiatrist's inclusion in the medical community, in which his role has rightly been that of a perennial pariah, were psychoanalysis and psychosomatic medicine. Now that one am an old psychiatrist, my colleagues rationalize their medical pretensions by reviving the antique claim that diseases of the brain cause diseases of the mind. Thus, the medical value of psychiatry now lies in discovering and demonstrating the biological etiology of mental diseases, such as depression and schizophrenia, and promising to cure them by means of drugs. Accordingly, the magic phrases justifying the psychiatrist's inclusion in the medical community are biological psychiatry and psychopharmacology, plus ka-change. Critical observations concerning the criteria of mental illness. In the previous section, I have only scattered some critical comments on the various criteria of mental illness. Now one want to expand on what one consider to be their most serious shortcomings. Mental illness as brain disease, psychiatry's savior or destroyer. While the idea that mental diseases are brain diseases is as old as psychiatry, the popularity of this view has waxed and waned during the past 2 centuries. It was dominant at the beginning of the 19th century, was replaced by the concept of moral insanity at mid-century, became dominant again toward the end of the 19th century, was eclipsed by the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic perspective during the middle decades of the 20th century, and is now dominant once more. Thus, in a guest editorial in the influential American Medical News, John Hanley, a professor of psychiatry at the University of California at Los Angeles, states, "Now, it is in the tradition of such experts, medical specialists, that they are masters of a body of knowledge about an organ system. What is the organ system of psychiatrists? If the domain of the cardiologist is the heart and circulatory system, then surely the domain of the psychiatrist is the brain and its system therein. To qualify and survive as physician specialists, we must become better brain scientists." This definition is at once descriptive and prescriptive. It not only identifies psychiatry as the study of the brain and its system therein, but also promotes this definition as necessary for the psychiatrist's survival as a physician specialist. It is not clear, however, why the psychiatrist's survival as a physician should concern us, or why we should assume, prima facie, that it is desirable. Phrenologists and homeopaths failed to survive as medical specialists, and few would regard their passing as a loss. In short, except for psychiatrists who place their loyalty to their guild above their loyalty to science, human welfare, or just plain common sense, the demise of psychiatry as a medical specialty is not, ipso facto, a calamity. To be sure, if psychiatrists are especially knowledgeable about the brain and the diseases that affect it, as Hanley and others claim, then they have a legitimate claim to being regarded as medical specialists. But if the domain of psychiatry is the brain and its system therein, then the difference between neurology and psychiatry is the same as that between a glass half full and a glass half empty. Maintaining such a distinction without a difference is indefensible both scientifically and economically. Given such a case, and if academic institutions aspire to be scientific and the law rationally enlightened, educators ought to teach either neurology or psychiatry, but not both. The law ought to recognize either neurology or psychiatry, but not both. And the government and insurance companies ought to pay for either neurological or psychiatric illnesses, but not for both. However, I would not advise anyone to hold his breath until that day arrives. I am pointing to a contradiction in the classic psychiatric claim that I think most people, and especially psychiatrists, overlook. Namely, that as soon as a disease thought to be mental is proven to be physical, it is removed from the domain of psychiatry and placed in that of medicine, to be treated henceforth by internists, neurologists, or neurosurgeons. This is what happened with paresis, pellagra, epilepsy, and brain tumors. It is an ironic paradox, then, that while definitive proof that mental illnesses are brain diseases would destroy psychiatry's raison d'etre as a medical specialty distinct and separate from neurology, the claim that mental illness is a brain disease has served and continues to serve as the psychiatrist's most effective justification for legitimacy as an independent medical discipline. Are mental illnesses brain diseases? What shall we make of the persistent psychiatric claim that the major psychoses, schizophrenia, and manic depression in particular, are proven neurochemical disorders of the brain? For example, Abram Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond, two prominent schizophrenia researchers and the originators of megavitamin therapy for mental illnesses, assert that schizophrenia is a physical disease, in the same way that pellagra and diabetes and mental retardation are physical diseases. The schizophrenic is a victim of a metabolic error in the chemistry of his body. Is this true or false? I am not an expert on the physiology of the central nervous system. I do know neurochemical research. I do not even prescribe drugs in my practice. But I can read. Hence, I know that ever since the earliest days of psychiatry, psychiatrists have claimed that mental diseases are brain diseases, that pathologists have never been able to confirm these claims, and that nevertheless, these claims have sufficed to establish psychiatry as a medical specialty. Today, aided and abetted by a vast non-medical mental health industry and many lay mental health groups, psychiatrists have at last succeeded in elevating the claim that mental illness is brain disease to the status of unchallengeable dogma. From the contemporary, conventionally accepted psychiatric point of view, rejecting the reality of the somatic basis of schizophrenia is just as absurd as rejecting the reality of the somatic basis of diabetes. Still, I believe this crucial psychiatric claim is either a monumental error or a monumental fraud, or a combination of both. In this book, and in many of my previous writings, I have assembled certain kinds of evidence in support of my position. Now, I want to offer additional evidence of a different sort in support of it, namely, the opinion of experts on diseases of the body, that is, pathologists. The testimony of pathology. Psychiatrists, as we saw, insist that schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis are brain diseases. Textbooks of pathology describe and discuss all known bodily diseases, including brain diseases. Accordingly, one way to verify whether schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis are brain diseases is to see what the authors of textbooks of pathology say about them. Well, the answer is that they do not say anything at all about these alleged diseases. They do not mention them, as they simply do not recognize mental illnesses as bodily diseases. The significance of this much neglected fact is enhanced by the pathologist's recognition of mental retardation, not as a disease to be sure, but as the manifestation of certain genetic disorders, such as Down syndrome, formerly known as Mongolism. In order to show that the psychiatric claim, now widely shared by lay mental health groups, that the major psychoses are proven brain diseases is completely unsupported by the opinion of pathologists, I have reviewed the principal contemporary textbooks of pathology, with the following result. Stanley L. Robbins, professor of pathology at Boston University Medical School, is the senior author of what is perhaps the most widely used textbook in the field, Pathologic Basis of Disease, 3rd ed. In this work, running to almost 1,500 pages, there is no mention of schizophrenia, manic depression, or any mental illness. Revealingly, the authors, who thus implicitly reject the reality or somatic basis of mental illness, do recognize the reality of the somatic basis of mental retardation. In the chapter on genetic disorders, they describe and discuss Down syndrome as well as Klinefelter's syndrome, 2 genetic disorders causing intellectual impairment. Anderson's Pathology, a 2-volume work running to nearly 2,000 pages, edited by John M. Kissane, professor of pathology at Washington University in St. Louis, also makes no mention of schizophrenia or manic depression. Finally, the most comprehensive contemporary text on pathological physiology, Sodeman's Pathologic Physiology, 7th ed., is also completely silent on the subject of schizophrenia and manic depression. In short, the authors of textbooks on pathological anatomy, biochemistry, and physiology do not mention the major mental illnesses, treating them either as if they did not exist or were not diseases. Viewed against this background, the claims of clinical psychiatrists who have no special competence in anatomy, biochemistry, or physiology may seem less convincing. For example, E. Fuller Torrey, a zealous propagandist for the view that schizophrenia is a brain disease and for the policy of treating it involuntarily, flatly asserts, in the last decade, research evidence has become overwhelming that these schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis are indeed brain diseases, just as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease are brain diseases. Evidently, Torrey's research evidence has not yet overwhelmed pathologists who write textbooks of pathology. As we saw, they recognize multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease as brain diseases, but they do not so recognize schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis. It is perhaps worth mentioning that defenders of the psychiatric faith ceaselessly criticize me for holding that mental diseases are not proven brain diseases, but never, absolutely never, address the inconsistency between their views and the pathologists' views on schizophrenia. It seems to me not unreasonable, however, that psychiatrists ought to convince pathologists that schizophrenia is a brain disease before they take it upon themselves to tell the public that it is such a disease, or try to silence those who disagree with them on this crucial issue. The testimony of internal medicine. In contrast to the way textbooks on pathology treat mental illnesses, textbooks of medicine, with chapters on schizophrenia and mood disorders written by psychiatrists, now present the major psychoses as proven brain diseases. For example, the reader of the 9th edition of the prestigious Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, 1980, the leading American textbook in the field, is authoritatively informed, as if it were a fact, that schizophrenia is a hereditary lifelong disease of the nervous system. Only 3 years later, in the 10th edition, 1983, the reader is told a quite different story. The dopamine hypothesis currently offers the most popular explanation for a biochemical mechanism of schizophrenia. The clinical potency of antipsychotic medications has been correlated with their ability to compete with dopamine at stereospecific dopamine binding sites. Furthermore, there is evidence that the schizophrenic-like psychosis produced by amphetamines is evoked either by a release of dopamine or by a heightened sensitivity in the dopamine receptors in the brain. Note that the explanation of schizophrenia offered here is advanced because it is the most popular, not because it is supported by the best evidence. The view that mental illness is brain disease has, of course, always been popular, and the writers of textbooks of medicine are evidently not above pandering to the craven desire of wanting to be on the winning side of a popularity contest. Indeed, Harrison's presents the affective psychoses in the same matter-of-fact way as proven brain diseases. Good evidence exists for the presence of genetic predisposition toward mood disorders. Recent work suggests that HLA-linked genes on chromosome 6 influence susceptibility to depressive disorders. Less work has been done on the neurochemical basis of mania, but it is believed to be due to an excess of norepinephrine, just as depressions are thought to be caused by a dearth of this neurotransmitter. These claims conflict with the views of experts on pathological anatomy and pathological physiology, who, as we saw, make no mention of such genetic and chemical lesions in their textbooks. The second major medical text, Cecil's Textbook of Medicine, 17th ed., 1985, offers the reader the same unverified psychiatric claims as if they were well-established facts. Written by Paul R. McHugh, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Oregon, the material on schizophrenia and manic depression is placed in a chapter titled Neurologic and Behavioral Diseases, making it appear that behavioral diseases are diseases of the nervous system. Here is how this prestigious textbook of medicine misinforms its readers. The genetic constitution has been decisively demonstrated to be one of the causes of schizophrenia. As with schizophrenia, an important genetic contribution to the etiology of the manic depressive disorder seems certain. A pharmacologically induced disorder has enhanced confidence that the mechanism for affective disorders is a neural one. How are we to account for this diametrically different handling by the authors of textbooks of pathology and medicine of the psychiatrists' claims concerning the somatic basis of the major mental illnesses? Why do pathologists ignore and implicitly, or even explicitly, reject the psychiatrists' claims about the somatic basis of schizophrenia and manic depression? And why do specialists in internal medicine accept these claims so eagerly and uncritically? I believe the reasons are, again, practical. In his daily work, the pathologist has no need whatsoever for the psychiatrist. Moreover, since the psychiatrist's claims about somatic pathology concern the pathologist's own expertise, the pathologist has no more reason to accept the fantastic and unsupported claims of psychiatrists than, say, an astronomer has to accept the fantastic and unsupported claims of astrologers. Accordingly, pathologists ignore, as unworthy of attention, the claims of psychiatrists concerning the somatic basis of mental illnesses. The situation of the specialist in internal medicine is quite different. Unlike the pathologist, who deals with organs, tissues, and cells, the practicing physician deals with patients. Unlike the pathologist, who examines cadavers or specimens of tissues or body fluids, the physician examines living persons. Persons behave and misbehave, and when they misbehave, the physician needs the psychiatrist to relieve him of the difficult patient. This, in my opinion, is why authors of medical textbooks treat psychiatric claims so differently than do the authors of textbooks of pathology. Because he needs the psychiatrist, the practicing physician cooperates with him and is often corrupted by him. The result is that the specialist in internal medicine shows his respect for psychiatry by accepting and legitimizing the psychiatrist's classic claim that mental illness is like any other illness. Schizophrenia reconsidered. As we have seen, there is vexing ambiguity inherent in the very idea of mental illness. Does it or does it not refer to a brain disease? Instead of confronting this ambiguity and trying to resolve it, psychiatrists have engaged in double talk, characterizing the same mental illnesses alternately as functional and organic, and even if functional, as organic. This posture is exemplified by the way psychiatrists treat the paradigmatic mental illness, schizophrenia. Typically, most psychiatrists now assert that while schizophrenia seems to be a functional illness, its organic basis will soon be discovered, a claim that suffers from all of the problems of definition, verification, and naming discussed earlier. Let me try once more to clarify the contemporary psychiatric claim, advanced with increasing vigor in recent years, that schizophrenia is a brain disease. What can we learn from this claim? Since contemplating the possibility that schizophrenia is not a disease is taboo to psychiatrists, they make no effort to clarify how the term schizophrenia is defined. Instead, they dramatize with horrifying examples what a terrible disease it is, and how terrible I am for denying its existence. For example, Heinz Lehmann, a professor of psychiatry at McGill University in Montreal, refers to my views on schizophrenia as follows. In fact, some psychiatrists call schizophrenia a myth and a metaphor, Szasz, 1961, denying it the status of a disease, emphasis added. Similar language is used by Goose, who begins an article on mental disease classification by raising the seemingly fatuous question of whether there is actually such a thing as mental disease. After observing that most doctors would answer, of course, Goose notes that there are some dissenters. And since the denial of mental disease may crop up among patients or their relatives, he writes, such a view merits a brief discussion, emphasis added. However, instead of discussing my views, Goose dismisses them by disparaging the attitudes of people who deny the very existence of mental disease, emphasis added. In a sense, psychiatrists like Lehmann and Goose are right in using the word denial to characterize my position concerning mental illness. However, I deny the miraculous transformation of malicious behavior into medical disease only because psychiatrists assert it, and I am accused of denying it only by those who believe in it, just as Jews deny the divinity of Jesus only because Christians assert it, and are accused of denying it only by those who believe in it. However, such assertions and denials mislead us from the nature of the controversy. The contention is about deeds, not words, about economic and political power, not theological or psychiatric abstractions. Before considering the content of the claim that schizophrenia is a brain disease, it is essential that we take notice of who are the persons who advance this claim most aggressively. They are psychiatrists and the relatives of schizophrenics. Non-psychiatric physicians and schizophrenic patients are notably unenthusiastic about this claim or expressly oppose it. For example, following the publication of a series of articles in the New York Times in March 1986 on schizophrenia as a brain disease, Ira Rose, the president of People Acting Together with Hope, wrote to thank the Times. We, as a parent support group, are extremely grateful for your series on schizophrenia. Recognition has long been overdue that this terrible brain disease is the fault neither of the victims nor their families, but is of neurobiological or genetic origin. We need the understanding and help of all society to see this disease as it truly is, a disabling brain disease. Although the information conveyed in such newspaper reports on schizophrenia may be untrue, the reports are very useful for answering the cui bono question, chapters 9 to 12. Moreover, if scientists, journalists, and educated people shut their eyes to the fact that the contention that schizophrenia is a brain disease pleases those who do not suffer from this alleged brain disease much more than those who supposedly do, then this observation itself ought to be considered an important element in what we mean by the term schizophrenia. I might add here, too, that the claim that schizophrenia is a brain disease does not prevent psychiatrists from also claiming that long-term psychotherapy is useful in treating schizophrenia. Long-term psychotherapy is not notably useful in treating other brain diseases, such as neurosyphilis or subdural hematoma. In their attempt to prove that schizophrenia is a disease, psychiatrists have gone to desperate lengths. For example, the late Silvano Arietti, recognized as one of the foremost modern authorities on schizophrenia, offered this nonsense to support his claim. When we consider the impact of schizophrenia on the present generation, there are about 40 million schizophrenics in the world. We conclude that no war in history has produced so many victims, wounded so many people. No earthquake has exacted so high a toll. No condition that we know of has deprived so many young people of the promise of life. After a lifetime of studying schizophrenia, Arietti seems to have forgotten that life can be a threat as well as a promise, and not only for young people. How does Arietti establish that schizophrenia is a disease? By asserting that it causes much suffering, by claiming that it is a disease characterized by an alteration in the way some cells function, and by the fact that some critics of psychiatry deny that schizophrenia is an illness. Some people, unfortunately among them even a few professionals, insist that schizophrenia does not exist, that it is a myth, and they succeed in getting considerable attention from the public and from the press because of the sensational nature of their statements. If we scratch the surface and search for the unconscious reasons for denying the existence of what is obvious and greatly disturbing, we eventually come to recognize that this denial is founded on a common and ancient prejudice toward mental illness. The fear of mental illness leads to its denial. The belief that we, too, may be wrongly labeled as schizophrenics leads to its denial. The apprehension that we may be secretly suffering from this disorder leads to its denial, emphasis added. Arrietty was sincere about the literal reality of psychiatry's sacred symbol and was duly rewarded for his faith by the keepers of the psychiatric keys. But sincerity is not necessarily a virtue. Assuredly, it is not a virtue when what the writer is sincere about is his firm belief that anyone who disagrees with him on a fundamental tenet of the psychiatric faith can be doing so only because he is insane. Many modern thinkers have faulted psychiatry and psychoanalysis for this debauchement of the rules of intellectual debate, but perhaps none severely enough. Isaiah Berlin, for example, although much troubled by this tactic, leans over backwards to excuse Freud for his role in promoting it and giving it a semblance of intellectual integrity. Freud, too, writes Berlin, contributed to this, not in his work of genius, but as the originator, however innocent, of the misapplication of rational psychological and social methods by muddle-headed men of goodwill and quacks and false prophets of every hue. After thus making the obligatory gestures of deference to Freud, the mythic hero, Berlin articulates elegantly the ugliness exemplified by Arrietty's previously quoted statement. It was left to the 20th century to do something more drastic than this. For the first time, it was now conceived that the most effective way of dealing with questions, particularly those recurrent issues which had perplexed and often tormented original and honest minds in every generation, was not by employing the tools of reason, but by obliterating the questions themselves. Questions for whose solution no ready-made technique could easily be produced are all too easily classified as obsessions from which the patient must be cured. Like Arrietty, most psychiatrists now believe that schizophrenia is a brain disease. Moreover, most of them now say this because they believe that scientists have recently discovered that what had been thought to be a functional illness is, in fact, an organic illness. This claim, too, is false. When we say that a person has an organic illness, what we mean is that there is something demonstrably wrong with his body. For example, when we say that a person is blind because of cataracts, we mean there is something wrong with his eyes. Whereas when we say that a person is blind because of hysteria, we mean that there is nothing wrong with his eyes. The ambiguity in such statements is due to the fact that the term blindness may be used to describe complaints as well as the effects of somatic lesions. Because the term schizophrenia may also be used to describe strange behaviors as well as the proven or putative effects of somatic lesions, it is similarly ambiguous. Hence, asserting that schizophrenia is a brain disease is choosing a particular definition for the term, not necessarily discovering a hitherto undetected brain lesion. To be sure, it is possible to discover hitherto unidentified brain lesions, but that can be done only on the brains of specific patients. If certain never-before-seen lesions were identified in the brains of mental patients and considered to be lesions specifically identifying schizophrenia, then, given the way schizophrenia is in fact diagnosed, it is certain that many schizophrenics would not have such lesions, and that many non-schizophrenics would. Would schizophrenics without schizophrenic lesions still be considered to be schizophrenic or psychotic or ill? Or would they be considered to be suffering from another, still unidentified mental illness? Or would they be considered to be mentally healthy? Making and unmaking mental illness. To understand what mental illness is, and also what it is not, it is necessary to ask and to examine three closely interrelated questions. 1. How do psychiatrists arrive at or generate psychiatric diagnostic categories? 2. Why do they pay so much attention to classifying mental diseases? And 3. Cui bono? Who benefits and who is harmed by psychiatric classification and the idea of mental illness itself? I shall address all 3 questions at length in the following chapters. Here I limit myself to a few observations about the APA's current role in psychiatric classification. In this connection, note that a standard American text for primary care physicians emphasizes that one of the criteria necessary for diagnosing schizophrenia is the absence of signs of organic brain disease, emphasis in the original. The cacophony of voices among establishment psychiatrists about the very subject matter of their discipline is an obvious symptom of the disorder whose anatomy one lay bare in this book. In November 1985, Robert Spitzer and his colleagues, charged with revising DSM-3, held the first of several meetings to consider 3 new mental diseases as possible additions to the existing list. The most important thing about these proceedings, a report in Time magazine cogently noted, is that DSM-3 is of crucial importance to the profession because its diagnoses are generally recognized by the courts, hospitals, and insurance companies. Although the social consequences of psychiatric diagnoses have always been important, the situation regarding psychiatric taxonomy was quite different a century ago. Then a single diagnosis was sufficient. A person was either insane, in which case he was incarcerated in a madhouse, or he was not, in which case he was left alone. The idea of insurance companies or government agencies paying privately practicing physicians to give psychotherapy to seemingly normal individuals would have been unthinkable, and not because what we now call psychotherapy did not exist. Another feature that characterizes the way psychiatric diagnoses are now made, and that differs from the way they were made 100 years ago, is equally revealing. Before identifying this difference, I want to anticipate what might occur to anyone reading this, namely that because of great technological advances during the past century, all physicians use different methods for making diagnoses now than they did then. Of course, but psychiatrists had no technical methods for identifying mental diseases a century ago and have none today. The change in their technique for generating new psychiatric categories is not technological, but political. A century ago, especially in German-speaking countries, from whence all of our major 19th century psychiatric diagnostic categories come, new psychiatric discoveries were made by individuals. For example, Ewald Hecker discovered hebephrenia, Emil Kraepelin, dementia praecox, Eugen Bleuler, schizophrenia. No individual American today would dare to do such a thing. It would be unseemly to be so individualistic, so autocratic, so undemocratic. Ours is the age of psychiatric groupthink. Group therapy has long been a popular method of mental healing. Now group invention discovery, defined as diagnosis, has been added to it. The APA now has task forces and consensus groups to make and unmake psychiatric diagnostic categories. This is how, in 1973, under pressure from gay rights groups, homosexuality was deleted from the roster of mental illnesses. No doubt anticipating problems with newly discovered mental diseases like paraphilic rapism and premenstrual syndrome, The psychiatrists invited several feminists and psychologists to their 1985 meeting. The proposal that rape is a disease so upset feminists, fearing that the diagnosis would provide an instant insanity defense for men who sexually assault women, that they threatened to sue. So Spitzer backed down. We probably will withdraw the diagnosis of rapism, he told the New York Times. It would be laboring the obvious to dwell on the fact that Spitzer and his colleagues are acting like legislators introducing new bills in Congress and supporting or withdrawing them, depending on how the political winds blow. This is not the way real doctors act. Medical research on AIDS has provoked violent responses of outrage from African authorities who feel their countries are stigmatized by the high incidence of the disease among their people. But these protests have not prompted Western AIDS researchers to withdraw their findings. Moreover, according to the report in Time magazine, when the feminists threatened to sue over the discovery of masochism, mainly afflicting women who stay in abusive marriages, the psychiatrists changed its name to self-defeating personality disorder. This surprised the feminists, who did not expect the meeting to descend into the usual picturesque result of successful lobbying, a bit of old-fashioned horse trading. Psychiatrists have indeed come a long way from the autocratic Teutonic days of Kraepelin and Bleuler, when solitary male psychiatric investigators staked their reputations on claiming to have discovered new diseases. Now we have psychiatric democracy, or mobocracy. That is, psychopathology by a consensus of charlatans, with women meticulously included among the mischief makers, with a stake in expanding the business. One of the invited psychologists, naively expecting something scientific to happen, complained, "The low level of intellectual effort was shocking. Diagnoses were developed by majority vote on the level we would use to choose a restaurant. You feel like Italian, I feel like Chinese, so let's go to a cafeteria. Then it's typed into a computer." However, it does not seem to matter how openly political, how obviously non-medical and unscientific are the ways and means by which psychiatrists create categories of mental illness. The medical and scientific community, as well as the lay public, continue to view psychiatry as a bona fide medical specialty and mental illness as bona fide illness. Carol Nadelson, the president of the APA for 1985 to 1986, smugly asserts, "Thanks to the use of DSM-3, the diagnosis of mental disorders is now generally as reliable as the diagnosis of physical ills. Psychiatry has emerged as a mature medical specialty whose methods of diagnosis and treatment are guided by a rational scientific approach. Psychiatry has proved itself in the laboratory." Is that so? Some hidden agendas of classifying mental illnesses as diseases. As we have seen, psychiatrists love to talk and write about how they classify mental diseases, but are considerably less eager to discuss why they do so, usually dismissing the latter question with some uplifting references to research and treatment. But the questions remain. Why do psychiatrists dwell so insistently on classification? Why do they periodically issue official documents reminiscent of papal bulls concerning formally recognized mental diseases? And why do they sometimes decide that previously recognized mental diseases are no longer diseases? No other medical specialists act this way. Only by observing these gross features of the psychiatric landscape, from an airplane flying overhead as it were, will we be able to see the forest as a whole. Otherwise, if we enter the forest by foot, we will soon get lost, lurching from tree to tree, each stump demanding our complete attention with its heart-rending tale of woe. Why do we place persons, animals, and things in definitional categories or boxes? One important reason is to enable us to act. The division of foods into those that are edible or inedible, or more precisely, into those God permits us to eat and prohibits us from eating, is a case in point. Here is a contemporary American example. Who is an American? There are at least 3 different answers to this question. One is native-born citizens of the United States, since only they qualify for the office of the presidency. Another, disregarding the exclusion specified in the Constitution as unimportant for most people, is anyone who legally qualifies for citizenship, that is, native-born as well as naturalized citizens. Finally, in the opinion of some people, for example, clergymen demanding unrestricted immigration from Central and South America, the answer is anyone who resides in or wants to come to the United States. The question of which phenomena we should admit to citizenship in the land of medicine, that is, which phenomena we should recognize as bona fide diseases, poses a similar problem. The issue is not only, or even primarily scientific, but practical and political. As some would benefit and others suffer from unrestricted immigration into the United States, so some people benefit and others suffer from elasticizing the definition of disease. To make matters more complicated, the people who benefit and suffer may be the same persons. It is important that we clearly understand this process as it applies both to disease and mental disease. Let us call the box into which we place all officially recognized diseases DX for diagnosis. Who profits from enlarging the number of items we put in this box? The persons who profit, not only economically but also existentially, are those who treat diseases and care for persons who have diseases. This is why physicians, especially psychiatrists, evangelize for the supposed benefits of viewing everything under the sun, from personal unhappiness to mass poverty, as a disease. Such persons act as if this perspective could yield only benefits through the compassionate treatment of victims by healthcare professionals and the generation of discoveries by research scientists. But that is not true. There are some glaringly obvious costs associated with the medical therapeutic perspective on life. One is economic, the other existential political. I shall briefly describe each. The economic consequences of enlarging the category DX. The economic consequences of what we place in category DX depend on the economic organization of society. In a purely individualistic, capitalistic society, it makes little difference what professional or governmental organizations classify as a disease. Since healthcare and medical research are paid for by private persons, the judgments of those economically uninvolved in these affairs are relatively unimportant. Private persons decide for what diseases, of their own or of others, to seek treatment and at what cost, and what medical research they choose to support. Obviously, we do not now live, nor have people ever lived, in this kind of society. I do not mention it because I believe that medically it would be the best of all possible societies, although it might be. I mention it only to set the stage for clarifying the implications of disease definitions in the kind of society in which we do live. Today, regardless of where we live in a society in which medical services, unlike liquor, cigarettes, or tickets to rock concerts, are not paid for by individuals out of their own pockets. In the United States, most of the money for health care comes from the government, federal and state, and from insurance companies, whose services are monitored by the government, and from a complex intermingling of these two sources. The definition of disease, as well as of physician, patient, hospital, and so forth, thus becomes a paramount factor in the calculations of third parties who hold the money bag. They are likely to pay for diseases that are in box DX, and will certainly not pay for those that are not in it. As a result, nearly everyone is both helped and harmed. For example, physicians and other healthcare professionals, insofar as they are the beneficiaries of a mammoth medical industrial complex, are helped. At the same time, insofar as they become the employees, slaves, or even scapegoats of the system, they are also harmed. Similarly, people in general, insofar as they are the beneficiaries of a system of healthcare free of direct cost to them, are helped. At the same time, people, insofar as they lose control over the definitions of disease and treatment and the terms of their relationship with their physicians, are also harmed. In the end, the harm will far outweigh the help, but it will be too late to go back. Perhaps a new beginning will still be possible. The existential consequences of enlarging the category DX. As everyone now realizes, changes in healthcare policies in the United States during the past several decades have resulted in many physicians making economic gains but suffering existential losses. Insofar as the issue before us is the existential consequences of enlarging or constricting the category called disease, the following observations are relevant. Inasmuch as pathologists study cells, tissues, and organs, they would lose much and gain nothing if they accepted conditions such as agoraphobia or kleptomania, not to mention masochism or terrorism, as bona fide diseases. Since they could never hope to find the cellular basis of these diseases, accepting them as bona fide diseases would only disfigure their own discipline. Similar considerations hold for all medical specialties, except psychiatry. No hematologist would claim diabetes as a blood disorder. No neurologist would claim prostatic hypertrophy as a neurological disease. No dermatologist would claim multiple sclerosis as a skin disease, and so on. But there is no disease already known or not yet discovered that psychiatrists do not claim as their own, that is, as a mental illness. Or, if it is not a mental illness, then as a disease that is nevertheless relevant to psychiatry, because its etiology might be mental or emotional, or because it might respond favorably to psychotherapy, or because it might exhibit a significant psychiatric overlay. All this makes the relationship between various medical specialties and psychiatry absurdly lopsided. The psychiatrist cast simultaneously in the roles of grandiose therapist and impotent charlatan. A few examples, familiar to anyone acquainted with the contemporary medical scene, will illustrate what I mean. There is no disease acute or chronic, minor or major, into which psychiatrists do not now feel entitled to meddle, no patient voluntary or involuntary, for whom they do not now claim to feel responsible. Here are some of the typical psychiatric rationalizations and justifications that make this possible. The patient with an acute life-threatening illness, like myocardial infarction, denies his illness. The patient with a chronic, debilitating illness, like lupus, is depressed by it. The patient with a minor illness, like basal cell carcinoma of the skin, overreacts to it. The patient with a major illness, like severe hypertension, underreacts to it, and so forth. No matter how a person, especially if he is already considered to be a patient, reacts, the psychiatrist can, and often does, interpret his behavior as a manifestation of mental illness, requiring the salvific interventions of the specialist in mental healing. In contrast, the dermatologist, hematologist, immunologist, oncologist, and other medical specialist does not view every mental illness from agoraphobia to schizophrenia as an opportunity for meddling or proving his importance. The grandiosity of psychiatric claims reaches its climax in modern psychosomatic fantasies of the mental causes and cures of various bodily diseases. These claims are, of course, merely the recycling, in secularized garb, of age-old religious fantasies attributing the cause of bodily illness to misbehaviors and its cure to miracles. Psychiatric research demonstrating that depression causes cancer illustrates the former type of claim, while the amazing anecdotes of Norman Cousins and other peddlers of bodily health through mental health illustrate the latter. These remarks should not be interpreted as meaning that I deny the influence of our personal lifestyle and social circumstances on acquiring or overcoming certain diseases. On the contrary, I regard such a connection as self-evident. Countless epidemiological and sociological studies illustrate its ubiquity. One of my favorite examples is the study reported in an article titled, "Is an Educated Wife Hazardous to Your Health?" The investigators answer their question with a resounding yes. A significant risk of all-cause and ischemic heart disease death was seen in men whose wives were more educated than they, compared with men whose wives were less educated. The risk was the highest for the least educated men with the most educated wives. These data support a causal role for status incongruity and fatal ischemic heart disease. To psychiatric imperialists, this proves the ubiquity of mental illness and the all-importance of psychiatry. To me, it proves only that since psychiatry deals with life, and since disease and death are a part of life, psychiatrists, not surprisingly, address themselves to disease and death in all their diversity. Actually, crisis intervention, liaison psychiatry, family therapy, suicide prevention, drug abuse counseling, grief therapy, and all the other variations on this tired theme add up to a rather ridiculous conclusion, namely that under the psychiatrist's microscope, every speck of dirt looks like a pathogenic microorganism with a sinister-sounding name to prove its dire disposition. It is a comic performance that is, however, no longer funny. The following witticism, said in jest about psychoanalysis in the 1930s, is now misinterpreted with absurd earnestness by psychiatrists and the public alike. The joke is this: if the patient arrives early for his appointment, he is anxious. If he arrives late, he is hostile. And if he is on time, he is compulsive. Mental illness über alles. This, then, is why absurdly the subclass called mental illness actually comprises more members than does the class called disease, of which it is itself supposed to be a member. The category called mental illness includes everything from Alzheimer's disease and brain injury to racism and terrorism, whereas the category called disease includes only somatic pathology. See figures 3.1 and 3.2. This paradox is due neither to accident nor to error. Instead, it is due to the elasticity of the category called mental illness, comprising fictitious diseases, and to the non-elasticity of the category called bodily illness, comprising hematologic, metabolic, infectious, and other diseases. Our capacity for describing phenomena is limited by our powers of observation, whereas our greed for practical advantage and a sense of control over others is unlimited. Barrows Dunham was not referring to psychiatric classification when he wrote the following, but he might just as well have been. When you want to organize knowledge, therefore, you will be careful to base the classifications upon essential qualities. You will thus derive classes in which the members have the greatest amount of resemblance to one another, and the greatest amount of difference from the members of other classes. But suppose that instead of organizing knowledge, you set out to organize ignorance and prejudice. You will then do precisely the opposite. You will keep the classification vague and flexible so that it can be made to include just whatever individuals you choose. Finally, I want to reemphasize that since the legitimation of the patient role, that is, the official acceptance of a person as a patient with a bona fide disease, has similarly far-reaching practical consequences, the boundaries of Category DX will also depend on what kinds of persons the official definers of disease want to credit or discredit as patients. The legal consequences of occupying the mental patient role are, of course, especially important. This brief overview of the economic and existential consequences of expanding the category of DX should make it clear that it is absurd to debate what is or is not a mental illness in medical or scientific terms. Science in the sense of disinterested taxonomic description has virtually nothing to do with the matter. In practice, the question is basically a consequential one. People agitate for or against enlarging the category of mental illness. For example, for or against counting masturbation, homosexuality, smoking, or rape as mental diseases because they desire or detest the consequences. Figure 3.2. Mental illness as metaphoric disease. A illness, bodily disease. B. Mental illness, non-diseases called diseases and treated as if they were diseases. In recent decades, the term medical model, ostensibly denoting a medical approach to mental illness, has gained wide currency. I consider this usage misleading, mainly because if mental illness is defined and accepted as an illness like any other, it makes no more sense to adopt a non-medical approach to it than it would to any other illness. On the other hand, if there is no such thing as mental illness, that is, if the phenomena so named are not diseases, then it makes no sense to adopt a medical approach to it. A reconsideration of paresis as the model of mental illness will help to clarify my argument. The paradigm of paresis. The classic psychiatric model of mental illness has always been, and still is, general paresis, syphilis of the brain. This disease often first manifests itself by means of mental symptoms, such as depression, excitement, and paranoid thinking. Untreated, the disease progresses rapidly to mental deterioration, dementia, and death. In addition to mental symptoms, the patient also exhibits objective neurological signs, for example, an abnormal pupillary reflex. It is important to keep in mind that before 1909, when organic arsenic compounds were discovered to be moderately useful against syphilis, there was no treatment for the disease, and that the effective treatment of the syphilitic infection, and hence the prevention of paresis, did not become a reality until the discovery of penicillin. In the 19th century, indeed, prior to the First World War, paresis was characterized by a rapidly downhill course, usually ending in death within a year or two. When Bleuler discovered schizophrenia, his model for it was paresis, and he said so. It is not yet clear just what sort of entity the concept of dementia praecox, schizophrenia, actually represents. It probably includes one or very few diseases, in the narrower sense, which constitute the major portion of cases, in the same way as general paresis embraces the majority of all cases of the dementia paralytica of the previous century. However, there is a curious paradox about paresis as the paradigm of the psychoses. The patient with dementia paralytica, which is what paresis was called in Kraepelin's day, exhibited objective neurological signs. The illness was characterized by a rapidly downhill course with an invariably fatal outcome, and at autopsy the patient's brain showed easily identifiable morphological, structural abnormalities. In contrast, the patient with dementia praecox, which is the name Kraepelin gave to what we call schizophrenia, exhibits no neurological signs. The illness is not characterized by a rapidly downhill course and is never fatal, and at autopsy, the patient's brain shows no identifiable morphological abnormalities. Some analogy. Ignoring these differences between paresis and schizophrenia, the early psychiatrists concentrated instead on two things. One was that both classes of patients acted crazy, demented, or were called crazy by others. The other was their own so-called clinical method. in reality only a euphemism for the psychiatrist's description of the behavior of persons locked up in insane asylums. By accepting such biased accounts as the manifestations of brain diseases, putative at the moment, proven as science progresses, psychiatry, as Mark Sedler writes, rather suddenly found itself to be a bona fide medical science. I shall summarize how this happened. The first psychiatrist to describe what is now called schizophrenia, disorganized type, was Ewald Hecker, 1843 to 1909. Like all the early psychiatrists, Hecker believed that the etiologies of the major psychoses were to be discovered through neuropathological investigations. Psychiatrists, and now laypersons too, still believe this. But to believe something does not mean that it is true. Indeed, doubt about this belief must have arisen because of the important differences between paresis and the other psychoses which I just mentioned. The suspicion that such doubt arose is supported by Hecker's following remarks in his original paper on hebephrenia, written in 1871. The final proof that hebephrenia is a unified form of mental illness in its own right can, of course, be established only on anatomical pathological grounds. But, because of the still provisional character of our knowledge of brain anatomy, we must renounce this proof, possibly for a long time to come. This is all the more likely, given that our patients generally live to a ripe old age, emphasis added. I submit that a brain disease so severe as to cause a rapidly progressive and virtually complete dementia, as the early psychiatrists saw it, but nevertheless compatible with a long and physically healthy life, is prima facie highly improbable, if not impossible. This, too, must have occurred to 19th-century psychiatrists, for Hecker remarks that hebephrenic patients are often accused of malingering, an accusation he dismisses as absurd. It seems clear that the discipline of psychiatry was made possible by the general acceptance of the proposition that it is not necessary to demonstrate that a patient has a brain disease in order to gain credence for the claim of having discovered one. It is enough to postulate it and to claim that the clinical method enables the specialist in mental diseases to diagnose it. What is this clinical method? It is, according to Hecker, the necessary conjunction of a phenomenological method, a longitudinal perspective, and a commitment to the project of identifying discrete disease forms. And here, once more, is Sedler eulogizing Hecker for this achievement. Hecker's concept of hebephrenia constituted a reliable and highly specific nosological instrument that enabled subsequent investigators to focus their medical perceptions on a clinically homogeneous population with a characteristic symptom complex and a predictable course. Taking general paresis as the standard example of a separate and distinct entity, he argued that hebephrenia is similarly unique, partly in consequence of its early onset and deteriorating course, emphasis added. Again, we witness the psychiatric observer leaving the well-trodden path of proving brain disease and instead spinning metaphors. Nosological instrument, focusing, symptom complex, deteriorating course, metaphors all, each substituting psychiatric prejudice for critical thinking and scientific investigation. For a discussion of metaphors, see Chapter 5. The Neurology of Mental Illness, a Case Study. Although the authors of DSM-3 reject pathoanatomical or pathophysiological lesion as the cardinal criterion of mental illness, psychiatric researchers continue to concentrate their efforts on attempts to discover the somatic basis of psychiatric disorders. Typical of such studies is a report by E.D. Ross and A. Rush on the neurology of depression. According to these authors, a major problem confronting both neurology and psychiatry is to define the neuroanatomical basis of psychiatric disorders. But if the neuroanatomical basis of psychiatric disorders is as irrelevant to the definition of mental illness as psychiatrists now claim, why is its discovery so important? In order to establish depression as a disease of the brain rather than of the mind, Ross and Rush detached the experience, symptom, of feeling depressed from the putative underlying disease. Brain-damaged patients with depression, they tell us, actually may deny being depressed or dysphoric. In other words, even though these persons are not depressed and do not seem depressed to those around them, they nevertheless are depressed. But this is not the way psychiatrists interpret the therapeutic effects of lobotomy on intractable pain. When the patient ceases to complain of pain after such a procedure, the physicians do not say that he still has pain, but denies it. On the contrary, they say that the patient has been relieved of his pain. The linguistic and logical tour de force implicit in asserting that persons who are not depressed suffer from depression thus deserves a brief comment. Depression is the name we give to a particular affective experience, our own or someone else's. Consider then the case of a person who does not feel depressed, and whom, because he does not seem or act depressed, no one else considers to be depressed. Comes now the modern psychiatrist who says, "You are wrong, this man is depressed. I know because I have found that he has the clinico-pathological correlates of depression." Without examining the validity or the invalidity of this claim, it seems to me reasonable to ask, when a psychiatrist who writes this way uses the word depression, does he mean the same thing people ordinarily mean when they say, for example, about someone who has just suffered a personal loss that he is depressed? I think not. I submit that, once again, instead of discovering an illness, as do the medical researchers who describe the pathology of AIDS and discover the virus that causes it, psychiatric researchers merely continue to announce a program intended to demonstrate that depression is primarily a disorder of the brain. To be sure, if psychiatric researchers find something wrong with a particular person's brain, then they have demonstrated that the person has a brain disease. But if the person in question is not depressed, then the researchers have, in my opinion, not discovered depression without symptoms of depression, or as they claim, asymptomatic depression as a discrete brain disease, but have only changed the meaning we usually attach to the word depression. If the history of psychiatry were a film played continuously in a movie theater, we might now say, "This is where we came in," and get up and leave. Almost 200 years have passed since psychiatrists have seriously begun to advance the claim that mental diseases are brain diseases, and that is exactly what they are still doing. The article, Ross and Rush conclude, presents an initial inquiry into the neurology of depression utilizing the technique of the clinico-pathological correlations. This, in turn, should establish firmly that depression is primarily a disorder of the brain and not simply a dysfunction of the mind. Surely, this is a grandiose conclusion from the evidence at hand. However, because people want to believe this, the claim seems credible. Thus, although psychiatrists still give us only a program for proving that mental illness is a brain disease instead of proof, the scientific community and the public accept the program as proof more eagerly than ever before. The somatic model of mental illness, medical or pediatric. When a speaker or writer on psychiatric matters uses the phrase medical model, he usually means or implies two things. First, that mental illness is an illness. Second, that we ought to treat it as if it were an illness. Neither proposition is novel. Why, then, did the fresh phrase medical model become so fashionable? And why do I say that it is misleading? Here, briefly, are the reasons why. Supporters of the medical model, typically psychiatrists, act as if they believed that if they could convince mental patients, their families, and above all, politicians, that persons called mental patients are truly sick, then they could treat them for their illness, regardless of whether or not the patients want to be treated. But such psychiatrists act not like internists, but like pediatricians, who must convince parents that their child is sick before they can treat the child, and having convinced the parents, can treat the child regardless of whether or not the child wants to be treated. Similarly, the opponents of the medical model, typically anti-psychiatrists, act as if they believe that if they could convince mental patients, their families, and above all, politicians, that the persons called mental patients are not really sick, then they could prevent psychiatrists from treating them, regardless of whether or not the patients want to be treated. In short, they too act like pediatricians, who, if they can convince parents that their child is not sick, can prevent the child from being treated, whether or not the child wants to be treated. These observations illustrate that both psychiatry and anti-psychiatry rest on a coercive pediatric model characterized by relations of domination and subjection, rather than on a non-coercive medical model of respect for persons characterized by relations of mutual cooperation and contract. Mental illness as a claim. Before concluding this survey of what counts as mental illness, I want to offer some brief remarks on one of the most interesting differences between bodily illness and mental illness, namely, that while the former may be asymptomatic, the latter cannot be. The notion of an asymptomatic mental illness is a self-contradiction. Symptoms, signs, illness. Physicians as well as sophisticated laypeople distinguish between two basically different kinds of manifestations of, or clues to, illness: subjective symptoms, such as fatigue or pain, and objective signs, such as elevated blood pressure or cellular abnormality in a biopsy or blood smear. This distinction corresponds to the distinction physicians make between bodily illness and mental illness. The former diagnosis, strictly interpreted, requires the presence of abnormal signs. The latter does not. Indeed, when confronted with a difficult diagnostic problem, physicians follow a procedure revealingly called ruling out organic disease. If no bodily disease can be demonstrated, a diagnosis of mental disease is usually made. With the distinction between symptom and sign or complaint and lesion firmly in mind, let us look at the similarities and differences between bodily illnesses and mental illnesses. It is obvious that bodily illnesses may, and often do, cause discomfort, pain, and suffering. It is equally obvious, however, that bodily illnesses may not cause any symptoms at all. They may, in other words, be asymptomatic. How do we know that a person has an asymptomatic disease? By the signs the disease produces. Especially in their early or latent stages, many diseases are, or may be, completely asymptomatic. For example, diabetes, leukemia, hypertension, malaria, malignant melanoma, syphilis. In short, an illness may manifest itself in two ways, by symptoms and signs, and may accordingly be identified in two ways, from symptoms and signs. Since in medical discourse symptoms point to signs or lesions, diagnoses of bodily diseases ultimately rest on the identification of signs or lesions. The situation with respect to mental illness is radically different. Why? Quite simply because mental diseases manifest themselves in only one way, by symptoms, and can accordingly be identified in only one way, from symptoms. It is important to note, in this connection, that the authors of DSM-3 are either confused about or want to obliterate the crucial distinction between sign and symptom, as their following statement shows. After emphasizing that their approach to classifying mental disorders is descriptive, in that the definitions of the disorders generally consist of descriptions of the clinical features of the disorders, they add that the characteristic features of the disorders consist of easily identifiable behavioral signs or symptoms, such as disorientation, mood disturbance, or psychomotor agitation, emphasis added. There is, however, no such thing as a behavioral sign. The items the authors so designate are simply behaviors described in psychiatric jargon rather than in plain English. To put the matter simply and succinctly, there are, and can be, only symptomatic mental illnesses. An asymptomatic mental illness is an oxymoron. How could a person who does not gamble suffer from pathological gambling? Or a person who does not drink alcohol suffer from alcoholism? Or a person who is never manic suffer from mania? Ironically, this fundamental conceptual identity between mental illness and mental symptom is tacitly acknowledged by the authors of DSM-3 in their characterization of what counts, for them, as a mental disorder. In DSM-3, each of the mental disorders is conceptualized as a clinically significant behavioral and psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is typically associated with either a painful symptom, distress, or impairment in one or more important areas of functioning, disability. Judged by these criteria, there can, in the absence of distress or disability, be no mental illness. Since it is obvious that this is not true for bodily illness diseases such as asymptomatic and undiagnosed hypertension or coronary atherosclerosis immediately spring to mind, it is difficult to see how psychiatrists can, in good faith, maintain that mental illness is like any other illness. By treating symptoms and signs as two independent variables, I have summarized in Table 3.2 the four combinations to which they give rise, namely, symptomatic and asymptomatic bodily illness, symptomatic mental illness, and no illness. Asymptomatic mental illness does not appear in this table for the simple reason that such a disease would have to be either a bodily disease, For example, schizophrenia, defined as a chemical abnormality of brain function, or a mental disease whose diagnosis is based on past symptoms or behavioral abnormalities. For example, a history of drinking or of depressed behavior. What I say here is not intended to minimize the practical importance of past behaviors. After all, if a person spoke French fluently a week ago, it is likely that he may do so again. The same is obviously true for the behaviors we call alcoholism, depression, or pathological gambling. Repetitive behavior is, however, still just behavior, notwithstanding the efforts of psychiatrists to interpret it as a sign of somatic pathology. Table 3.2 Bodily illness and mental illness, signs and symptoms. 1. Symptomatic bodily illness. 2. Asymptomatic bodily illness. 3. Symptomatic mental illness may be mistaken for undetected and possibly as yet undetectable bodily illness, and vice versa. Detectable illness. In their zeal to imitate physicians, psychiatrists have, of course, constructed asymptomatic mental illnesses. The most characteristic member of this class is, or better, was, latent homosexuality. We must say was because even overt homosexuality is now no longer considered to be a mental illness. Revealingly, it was Freud and the psychoanalysts who created this doubly metaphoric mental illness. That is, an illness that consists not merely of disapproved desire or behavior, but of desire or behavior assiduously resisted or avoided by the subject who supposedly suffers from it. Symptoms, literal and metaphorical. Our efforts to understand bodily illness and mental illness are hampered, indeed paralyzed, by a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of symptoms and signs. They are not two similar manifestations of disease, as commonly believed. Instead, they are two radically different phenomena. Symptoms are verbal communications or claims. Signs are objective measurements of bodily structures or functions, or publicly verifiable observations about the body, not about how a person feels about his body. This is the reason why bodily illness is typically diagnosed when and because a person exhibits a physical chemical abnormality in the structure of his body. For example, bleeding, jaundice, a fractured bone, visible to the naked eye or by X-ray, fever, high blood pressure. Mental illness, on the other hand, is typically diagnosed when and because a person makes certain claims about the behavior of a person, himself or others, considered to be a designated patient. A person's nonverbal behavior may, of course, also be evidence for or against mental illness. For example, a person who kills a group of people he does not know is now likely to be characterized, on the basis of his behavior alone, as mentally ill. I shall say more about this presently. Since the act of lodging a claim is intrinsic to the origin and nature of the phenomena we call mental illnesses, but is irrelevant to the origin and nature of the phenomena we call bodily illnesses, it is remarkable that this distinction has been so neglected, not only by psychiatrists, but also by philosophers, who often make reference to mental illness. To put it simply, bodily disease can be, but mental illness can never be. Discovered and diagnosed without any claims of illness being lodged either by or about the patient. For example, a person undergoing a routine medical examination for admission to college or entrance into the armed forces may be discovered, on the basis of blood or urine tests, to have diabetes or leukemia. Before the testing, neither the subject nor anyone else claims that he is ill. Yet it is discovered that he is ill. Clearly, it is not possible to discover mental illness in a similar way. Why not? The answer to this question further highlights the linguistic problems hidden behind the phenomena we now call mental illnesses. The reasons for the distinctions between bodily illness and mental illness lie in part in the different ways we use and interpret the word symptom in medicine in reference to bodily illness, and in psychiatry in reference to mental illness. An example will clarify what I have in mind. Suppose a middle-aged man complains of precordial pain. That is a symptom. What does it mean? To the patient, it might mean that he has coronary artery disease, but it does not mean that to a good doctor. To the physician, the patient's precordial pain is a clue pointing to something unknown. It might be coronary artery disease, or gallbladder disease, or arthritis, or the fear of heart disease, or none of the above. The word symptom here is used literally. It means that it may be the manifestation of some pathological process in the body, disease. In psychiatry, not only is the word illness used metaphorically and interpreted literally, but so also is the word symptom. This is crystal clear from the way we use what we call the two classic symptoms of psychosis, namely hallucinations and delusions. For example, unlike precordial pain, which may or may not point to coronary insufficiency, hallucinations and delusions do not point to psychosis. They are the same as psychosis. If a psychiatrist acknowledges or recognizes that Jones is having hallucinations and delusions, he has no choice but to conclude that Jones is psychotic. The reason for this lies in the prejudgments that words such as hallucination and delusion carry with them. Consider some simple examples. When a lonely, deinstitutionalized ex-mental patient populates his world with imaginary persons who talk to him, we say that he is hearing non-existent voices and is hallucinating. But when Beethoven hears melodious sounds in his head, we do not say that he is hearing non-existent music and is hallucinating. Similar considerations apply to the false ideas of religious leaders, which we do not call delusions, unless we want to delegitimize them and those who hold them. But we do call the false ideas of mental patients delusions. Here is another, less abstract example, illustrating the role of language and power in determining what is a mental symptom, mental illness. Johnny, a high school student, acts distracted, neglects his studies, and makes it otherwise clear by word and deed that he is quite smitten by his girlfriend. The father reassures his wife, "Don't worry, Johnny is just showing symptoms of being in love." Everyone treats the word symptom in this sentence as a metaphor, even persons who do not know what a metaphor is. However, with only a slight change in the scenario, the situation might be very different. Johnny, now in college, gets poor grades, drops out of school, comes home, mopes around the house, acts taciturn and withdrawn, refuses to look for a job or help around the house, and perhaps makes some veiled threats about killing himself. The mother tells her husband, "I am worried about Johnny showing symptoms of schizophrenia." Everyone treats the word symptom in this sentence as if it were a literal use of the term, that is, as if it pointed, possibly or probably, to the existence of a real disease. Suppose further that, more or less against his will, Johnny is carted off to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist examines him, ostensibly to determine whether or not he is mentally ill. Insofar as the psychiatrist's examination is directed to answering this question, it is bound to be a charade. How can any psychiatrist worth his salt conclude that Johnny, exhibiting such behaviors, is not mentally ill? Clearly, unless the report about Johnny's behavior is false, the psychiatrist has no choice but to find mental illness. His options are limited to finding one or another mental illness, a relatively benign one or a very malignant one. The reason for this is that in psychiatry, mental symptom equals mental illness, an equation quite undisguised in so-called extreme cases. For another example, suppose that, in a rural area, neighbors summon the police to complain about offensive odors emanating from a ramshackle house inhabited by a recluse and his old mother. The police go to investigate. They find a middle-aged man in tatters, malnourished, with a multitude of cats and dogs in a filthy house, and with the man's aged mother dead in bed. When asked what happened, the man tells the police he had to strangle his mother because she complained of being in pain, and God told him he must help her. Who would doubt that the man is mentally ill? What are the symptoms of his illness? The very behavior I have described. Whether the problem is this hypothetical man's behavior or the behavior of any other person committing a bizarre crime, John Hinckley, Jr., is a good example. The mere idea of asking for an explanation of what happened makes the ordinary person impatient. He already knows what happened. Only a crazy person would do such a crazy thing. Crazy act equals mental symptom. Mental symptom equals mental illness. Mental symptom does not point to a possible illness. It is the same as a mental illness. "You may ask me where I obtain my ideas," wrote Beethoven. "I cannot answer this with any certainty. They come unevoked, turn into tones which resound, roar, and rage until at last they stand before me in the form of notes." Mental illness as religious symbol. In this chapter 1 have begun to sketch the outlines of the idea of mental illness. By the time the reader comes to the end of the book, I hope I will have succeeded in painting a life-sized portrait of it. One important feature of this concept is, however, already clear, namely, that mental illness is an idea without boundaries. It blends into everything around it. First and foremost, mental illness blends into medicine. Then it blends into history, politics, education, law, criminology, sociology, art criticism, literature, mythology, religion, everything except the hard sciences. And therein lies an observation I want to offer before ending this chapter. I have long argued that there are important parallels between religion and psychiatry, a theme one do not want to belabor here. However, the absence of a clear boundary between mental illness and everyday life warrants a brief restatement of my core argument, namely, that the ideas of mental health and mental illness have replaced the idea of God and the devil, and that the institutionally legitimized explanations, justifications, and interventions of psychiatry have replaced those of organized religion. During the Middle Ages, James Turner observes, no clear lines separated the religious from the secular. The church and the world blended. Today, no clear lines separate the psychiatric from the non-psychiatric. The explanations, justifications, and interventions of psychiatry permeate the world and blend with it. Chapter 4. Being a mental patient. God is a fact. Similarly, my disbelief in mental illness does not mean that I do not recognize the existence of psychiatrists and mental patients. It is precisely because supernatural beings and mental diseases are abstract or imaginary constructs without material existence that their existence is claimed or inferred in a circular fashion from the existence and belief of priests and worshippers, of psychiatrists and mental patients. However, it would be a mistake to believe that the existence of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome proves that Jesus is the Son of God, or that the existence of the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda proves that mental illness exists, although this has, more than once, been seriously suggested to me by people listening to me lecture on the myth of mental illness. In short, although mental illness may not exist, mental patients do. Who then are they? What is wrong with them? Why are they considered to be ill, and why mentally? Becoming a mental patient. Psychiatrists rarely consider the question of how a person becomes a mental patient, and when they do, their answers are likely to be wrong. For example, Jack Ewalt and Dana Farnsworth, both professors of psychiatry at Harvard, write, "A person thus becomes a patient when his capacity to compensate for all the unfavorable factors in his emotional environment breaks down, and he is unwillingly or unknowingly impelled to indulge in behavior which is unacceptable to himself or those with whom he is associated or comes in contact." It is not true, however, that a person becomes a patient when there is a change in his capacity to cope, or because he unwillingly or unknowingly misbehaves. The truth is that a person becomes a patient when he defines himself or when others define him as a patient, and when that definition is formally or officially supported as legitimate or valid. Specifically, for a person to become a psychiatric patient, two circumstances must come together. 1. An individual must make certain claims about himself, or others must make certain claims about him. That is, he must designate himself or be designated by others as mentally ill. 2. A psychiatrist or judge must concur with this claim. That is, he must diagnose or validate the designated person as mentally ill. When this process has run its course, the product is the social phenomenon called a mental patient, or more accurately, a designated mental patient. The mental patient, voluntary or involuntary. Persons assume or are assigned to the role of mental patient in several ways. Some come from among persons identified in Table 2.1, Row 3. Typically, such an individual seeks out a physician with what he, the patient, believes or claims to be the symptoms of a medical disease. The physician examines him, but can find nothing wrong. If the patient persists in making demands on his doctor, and if the doctor grows tired of his demands, then the doctor is likely to refer the patient to a psychiatrist. It is estimated that 60,070 or even 80% of patients seen by general practitioners and family physicians have no demonstrable bodily illness. Many of these persons are recruited into and join the ranks of mental patients. Another group of mental patients is comprised of persons who seek out psychiatrists on their own initiative for the help they hope to obtain from them. Although these patients are physically healthy, or if not, their diseases are considered to be unrelated to their complaints, they want some sort of psychiatric help and willingly cooperate with a variety of so-called psychiatric treatments, psychological as well as physical. Insofar as a person assumes the role of mental patient voluntarily, his situation resembles that of any other client seeking professional help. The clients of architects, attorneys, accountants, and physicians differ in terms of the sorts of service each seeks, but are similar in that each is free to initiate and terminate his relationship with the expert who, as the saying goes, is on tap, not on top. However, it is precisely with respect to the ability or power to control the expert-client relationship that the situation of the mental patient typically differs from that of the medical patient. To understand this difference, we have to consider the history of psychiatry, as well as the connection among the ideas of insanity, incompetence, and irresponsibility. Medicine, psychiatry, and self-ownership. With the exception of psychiatry, the practice of modern Western medicine is premised on the principle of the self-ownership of adults. Typically, doctors and patients are free to reject each other. In other words, each must consent to the relationship, the doctor to providing medical care, the patient to receiving it. Diagnostic and therapeutic interventions are medically legitimate because they are scientifically prudent, and legally legitimate because the patient consents to them. See Table 4.1. Table 4.1. Illness and Consent, the Politics of Medical Intervention. Nature and Name. 1. Medical intervention in the presence of disease with the sane subject's consent. Conventional treatment of injuries, infections, tumors, etc. Literal treatment. 2. Medical intervention in the presence of disease without the sane subject's consent. Medically, treatment without consent. Legally, assault and battery. 3. Medical or psychiatric intervention in the absence of disease with the sane subject's consent. Abortion, voluntary psychiatric interventions, etc. Metaphoric treatment, not treatment. Help. 4. Medical intervention in the absence of disease without the subject's consent. Involuntary psychiatric interventions, not treatment, social control, punishment, torture. This fundamental political principle of self-ownership, which undergirds not only medical but also economic and legal relations in free societies, was nearly fully articulated by Aristotle. According to it, a person owns himself, body and soul, and has the right to use himself as he deems fit, so long as he does not injure others. Aristotle's only reservations to this principle were with respect to suicide and slavery. He considered suicide to be a violation of man's obligations to the state, and slavery to be the natural condition of the slave. Defining a voluntary agent as one who knows both the person he is affecting by his action and the instrument he is using, Aristotle concluded that it is not possible to treat oneself unjustly. No one can commit adultery with his own wife, or housebreaking on his own house, or theft on his own property. It is this principle that has led to the adoption of the legal rule that no one except infants, idiots, and the insane ought to be medically diagnosed or treated without his consent. I am stating this in the classic idiom of English law, dating from a time when a man was regarded as insane only if he was like a wild beast. There are two ways in which major departures from this principle may be rationalized and justified. One way is to expand the class constituting exceptions to the rule, typically by treating certain persons, for example women, criminals, blacks, mental patients, as if they were children. This, of course, is called paternalism, and I shall say more about it presently. The other way out of the political constraints of self-ownership is to reject the principle altogether, or to qualify it with strong claims of co-ownership, as it were, in favor of possession by other parties, such as God or the state. For example, if God owns the body and wishes it to be inviolate to human prying, then dissection will be considered a crime. This perspective is by no means extinct today. Those who do not share it call it religious fundamentalism. Similarly, if the state owns the body, then the drugs legislators condone will be considered licit and therapeutic, whereas those they condemn will be considered illicit and pathogenic. And suicide will be illegal, not because it is an affront against the rules of God, but because it is an affront against the rules of health. Many years ago, I proposed the term therapeutic state for the political system generated by and embodying this principle. Ironically, many of our contemporary medical and psychiatric dilemmas arise from the fact that the more physicians are recognized as experts on health, the more power they are given to determine the social behavior of sick persons. Chemists know how to distinguish gold from other elements better than ordinary people, but the state gives them no power over the conduct of persons possessing gold. However, supposedly because psychiatrists know how to distinguish sick minds from healthy minds better than ordinary people, the state gives them power over the conduct of persons allegedly possessing sick minds. The following statement by Norman Fowler, British Secretary of State for Social Services, is sadly revealing. "I think that schizophrenia is a medical illness," Fowler told The Times, London, "and patients should have whatever treatment the doctors think necessary." Emphasis added. Well, arthritis and atherosclerosis are also medical diseases. Does Fowler propose that patients no longer be permitted to reject being treated for these diseases? If this is how the second highest ranking British politician in charge of health policies thinks and talks, can we expect anything else but a further strengthening of the powers of a centralized, medicalized therapeutic state? Like marriage, the relationship between psychiatrist and patient involves two persons. Accordingly, it is the combination of the former's penchant for paternalism with the latter's desire for dependency that creates the relationship that ultimately develops between them. The truth is that not only are many psychiatrists not interested in a reciprocal type of relationship with their patients, but many mental patients are not interested in such a relationship either. Whether we like to or not, what characterizes many psychiatric patients and situations is precisely that they are coercive. Schizophrenic self-disregard, agitated depression, threats of injury to self or others are intensely coercive communications. Indeed, in the interview in The Times from which I just quoted, a typical problem presented by schizophrenic patients was seen as this. "Have you," the interviewer asks Fowler, "any other ways you can help? For example, widowed mothers living in terror of being attacked physically by very strong sons. Some illness." "I have no blanket solution for that," replies Fowler. Thomas Hobbes would have had a solution for it. When Britain was the cradle of Western liberties, its leaders knew that crime was not a disease and that disease was not a crime. Obviously, anyone who interacts with a violent person, especially if he chooses to do so, and if the violent person is called a mental patient or a schizophrenic, finds himself in a situation where he is expected to do something. The superior person, family member, psychiatrist, policeman, placed in such a position has essentially three options. 1. He can counter-coerce, for example, by committing the patient as psychotic. 2. He can allow himself to be coerced, for example, by catering to the demands of the patient. Or 3. He can escape from the field, for example, by severing the relationship with the coercing person, or he can take care and not enter the field in the first place. Medicine and psychiatry, becoming a patient and becoming a mental patient. Medicine originates from the facts of injury and illness, the discomfort and disability they cause, and the search for relief they generate. Persons become medical patients because they suffer, seek relief from their suffering, and turn for relief to experts whom they endow, rightly or wrongly, with the power of healing. In short, medical practice originates from below, from the patient, and medicine is as old as mankind. Moreover, the feature of voluntariness is crucial to being a medical patient. Indeed, it is so basic that we take it for granted. Unless unconscious, a person typically enters a hospital by checking in, much as he enters a hotel, and he can, of course, check out whenever he wishes. There is no legal mechanism for forcing a person to enter a hospital or remain there against his will. Unconscious persons are regarded as having given tacit consent to being patients. Unlike medicine, psychiatry originates from the facts of deviant and disturbing behavior, sometimes caused by brain disease, the discomfort and distress such behavior causes others, and the search for the control of the disturbing behaviors and persons by those disturbed. Persons thus become psychiatric patients because they make others suffer, because those they make suffer seek relief from their discomfort, and because these sufferers turn for relief to experts whom they endow, rightly or wrongly, with the power to restrain and treat the offending person who is designated as mentally ill. In short, psychiatric practice originates from above, from those having power over the patient, and psychiatry is only as old as is this particular social arrangement for controlling those who burden or offend others. Historically, psychiatry is synonymous with involuntary and institutional psychiatry. Originally, all mental patients were involuntary patients, incarcerated in mental institutions. This arrangement prevailed from the first invention of madhouses in the 17th century until the early part of the 20th century. As recently as the early 1940s, when I was a medical student in Cincinnati, a person could not be a voluntary patient in an Ohio state mental hospital. That arrangement was consistent with the view that madness or insanity, now called severe mental illness or psychosis, is a condition characterized by a loss of competence or rationality. It is the nature of psychiatry, write Albert Johnson and Burr Eichelman, two medical ethicists, to work with patients who suffer from impaired perceptions of themselves and the world. It is an impairment of the consenting organ itself which is being treated. The authors go on to observe that, of course, this has always been the condition of psychiatry. Its patients have always been the troubled, the confused, the deranged. As a result, psychiatric treatments, such as commitment, the shock therapies, and psychosurgery, were often imposed on the supposedly incompetent. It is important to re-emphasize that the medical patient has typically been presumed to be competent, whereas the mental patient has typically been presumed to be incompetent. Competence is one of those troublesome concepts that combines an observer's subjective judgment with an objective condition supposedly exhibited by the subject. In actual use, such concepts are bound to be corrupted by the self-interests and prejudices of the judging parties. For centuries, it was taken for granted, and it is still widely believed, that an insane person is irrational and legally incompetent. The range of this incompetence varies, but typically includes such things as looking after one's own best interests, executing binding contracts, being responsible for the crimes one commits, and standing trial. These remarks, on which I shall expand later, see chapters 8-11, are intended to remind the reader that although incompetence and insanity are not purely medical concepts, or perhaps are not medical concepts at all, modern societies use physicians, and physicians use these concepts to implement mental health laws. Thus, while experts on forensic psychiatry often disclaim insanity and mental disease as medical concepts, legislators deputize doctors to enforce laws based on these very concepts. For example, Herbert Fingaret, who writes frequently on forensic psychiatry, states, "In our earlier examination of the notion of mental disease, we saw that it is not a medical concept. That is, it is in fact not defined by current medical doctrine, could not even in theory have any systematic role within purely medical doctrine, and moreover is now increasingly recognized by the courts as a legal rather than a medical concept." Notwithstanding many similar assertions in the legal literature, physicians are legally authorized to commit a person to a mental hospital, detain him there as a patient, and treat him for his mental disease against his will. Thus, under the 1959 British Mental Health Act, any qualified medical practitioner can sign an emergency order. No expertise in psychiatry is required. Perhaps because insanity has in fact no medical meaning, many mental health laws require that not one but two doctors sign the commitment papers, presumably in order that one could act as a corrective to the other, but actually to strengthen the medical legitimacy of the procedure. Today, the importance of involuntariness in the role of mental patient is as great as it ever was, perhaps greater. This fact is concealed, however, both by private psychiatric practice and by what is, ostensibly, voluntary mental hospitalization. I say ostensibly because no person can properly be said to be a voluntary mental patient so long as he can be intimidated by the threat of involuntary incarceration. Indeed, Because of the overt and covert threat of involuntary mental hospitalization, it is impossible to say how many persons now enter or stay willingly in mental hospitals. Moreover, even the person who enters a mental hospital voluntarily cannot leave at will. His status is easily converted from voluntary to involuntary. Finally, there is a large and important class of mental patients comprised of persons who become patients by breaking the law and are then diverted from the criminal justice system to the mental health system. Such persons are, in effect, sentenced to incarceration in a mental hospital instead of a prison. It is now also possible to sentence such persons to involuntary patienthood in psychiatric outpatient facilities. Let me now summarize the similarities and differences between the conventional uses of the terms patient and mental patient. The term patient is reserved for persons who assume the sick role by asserting that they are ill or by having some type of identifiable relationship with a physician or hospital. Persons complaining of being ill, regardless of where they may be, and persons situated in hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, and physicians' offices are thus all called patients. On the other hand, if a person does not seek medical help and has no identifiable formal relationship with a medical personage or institution, he is not, even if he has a demonstrable bodily illness, considered to be a patient. For example, it would be wrong to call a Christian Scientist suffering from cancer but refusing medical help a patient. Insofar as a person voluntarily assumes the role of mental patient, either by asserting that he is mentally ill or by establishing an identifiable relationship with a mental health professional, the roles of patient and mental patient are similar. The two roles differ, however, in all those ways in which it is possible to ascribe the role of mental patient, but not of medical patient, to a person against his will. For example, virtually anyone in conflict with the law may be declared mentally ill. Such persons are then typically called mental patients, especially if their involuntary psychiatric scrutiny is legally legitimized, for example, as part of a court-imposed plea of insanity or ruling of incompetence to stand trial. This is why we are often told not only that there are millions of mentally ill persons in this country who do not receive the psychiatric care they need, but also that there are millions of mental patients who do not receive such care. By contrast, there are millions of poor people suffering from leprosy or malaria in underdeveloped countries who are never called patients. In short, anyone called mentally ill is ipso facto also considered to be a mental patient, and vice versa. I view this conflation of the alleged condition called mental illness and the social role of mental patient as further support for my contention that mental illness is a non-existent or fictitious condition, because there is no way of objectively establishing that a person suffers or does not suffer from mental illness. The condition is inferred from the social role, and vice versa. Being a mental patient and having a mental illness, is there a difference? As I have shown, having an illness and being a patient are concepts that vary independently. It is possible to have an illness and not be a patient, or to be a patient and not have an illness. This is not true for the relationship between having a mental illness and being a mental patient, especially if the role is ascribed rather than assumed. It is not possible to be a properly certified mental patient and not have, that is, not be considered to have, a mental illness. For example, even if a person is regarded as having been improperly hospitalized, he is still considered to have been a patient. A single illustration should suffice. Between 1980 and 1984, a period during which psychiatrists have continued to trumpet the triumphs of the pharmacological treatment of mental illnesses, making hospitalization largely unnecessary, adolescent admissions to private psychiatric hospitals increased more than 350%, from 10,765 to 48,375. According to a report in Newsweek, in many cases young people are being hospitalized for afflictions such as conduct disorder and adolescent adjustment disorder, emphasis added. Nowhere do the reporters for Newsweek question that these youngsters have bona fide mental diseases or are bona fide patients. My contention that psychiatrists have succeeded in combining and equating mental illness as a condition and the mental patient role is also exemplified by the psychiatric approach to malingering, now called factitious disorder. The unique aspect of these factitious disorders is that the sole objective is to assume the role of a patient, without an acute emotional crisis or a recognizable motive. Indeed, without a need for treatment, many of these patients make hospitalization itself a primary objective and often a way of life. Here, a person is defined as a patient solely because he wants to be a patient, and as mentally ill solely because he is a patient. Revealingly, psychiatrists do not consider such alleged maladies to be metaphoric. As in all forms of factitious illness, assert the authors, the production of the illness is factitious, but these patients are truly ill, emphasis added. The authors seem to relish the internal contradictions inherent in their image of this non-illness that is really an illness. After emphasizing that persons suffering from factitious disorders assume the patient role even though they are without a need for treatment, they explain that the introduction of these disorders into the official psychiatric nomenclature is expected to stimulate research in the area of treatment. When the mental patient is not a patient, since classifying persons as patients serves the purposes of the classifier, some people will try to enlarge the category called patients, and others will try to constrict it. I have cited some examples of the effort to expand this category, and now want to cite some examples of the effort to constrict it, specifically, of defining persons conventionally regarded as mental patients as not patients. I have always believed that people appreciate a service in proportion to what they pay for it, and vice versa. This principle is certainly supported by the fact that companies selling health insurance have traditionally rebelled against the idea that mental illness is like any other illness. During the past several decades, however, they have increasingly been forced by psychiatric lobbyists and their supporters in the various state legislatures to accept this absurd proposition. The coverage of alcoholism, chemical dependency, and other autogenous diseases has, of course, contributed its share to the burgeoning cost of health insurance. You may be startled to read, observes financial columnist Sylvia Porter, that a large percentage of the total healthcare bill employers pay goes to mental health care, often as high as 20%. As a result, she continues, psychiatric care will be separated from other medical expenses in employee assistance programs. For funding purposes, such programs are treated apart from group health benefits, emphasis added. A specific effort to constrict the category called mental patient is reflected in certain health insurance policies. Many insurance companies offer policies paying benefits in case of illness. Some reimburse hospital and related medical expenses, while others pay cash benefits directly to the policyholder for being in a hospital. How do policies of the latter type define whether a person should be counted as a patient and hence a proper recipient of benefits? They do so by reference to whether or not he resides as a patient in an institution called a hospital. This makes the criteria for determining whether an institution qualifies as a hospital crucial, since it is the definition of a hospital that will determine whether the insured person is or is not a bona fide patient. The typical health insurance policy providing direct cash payments in case of confinement in a hospital defines hospital as follows. Hospital means an institution which diagnoses and treats injured and sick persons. Hospital does not mean a mental institution or a place for the care and treatment of drug addicts or alcoholics, emphasis added. If the insurance industry insisted that mental hospitals are not hospitals, period, there would perhaps be less confusion about the differences between bodily illness and mental illness. Instead, the industry has chosen to legitimize mental illness as a bona fide illness, underwriting special coverage for it, thus creating one of the most lucrative business enterprises of our day, the private mental hospital corporation. The most frequently encountered mental patient. My foregoing analysis is supported by the account American psychiatric authorities give of the most commonly encountered mental patient, namely, the person suffering from a personality disorder. Here is what the authors of the Comprehensive Textbook of Psychiatry, 3, tell us about him. Those with personality disorders crowd the rosters of clinic dropouts, treatment failures, and referrals to other agencies. For the very persons whom psychiatry labels with the term personality disorders are the same persons called bad or deviant, sinning, or loathsome. Doctors hate hypochondriacs. Attempted suicide is still a felony on many statute books, and the righteous and intolerant single out paranoiacs for special disdain. Those with personality disorders make up a large percentage of people in jails, on welfare rolls, and in the general practitioner's waiting rooms. The mind boggles. Hypochondriacs, paranoiacs, individuals who attempt suicide, bad persons are all sick, suffering from the dreaded disease called personality disorder. I want to emphasize that the authors of this prestigious text do not claim that persons suffering from personality disorders exhibit demonstrable brain diseases, as do persons with organic mental disorders, or that they suffer from the manifestations of probable brain disorders, as, according to them, do persons with schizophrenia, or that they want to assume the role of mental patient, as they say, do persons with neuroses. In short, although persons with personality disorders exhibit none of the criteria of mental illness used in the other chapters of this textbook, that is, proven brain disease, putative brain disease, or assuming the role of mental patient, they are nevertheless classified as suffering from a mental illness. Why? Because they are functionally disabled. Concerning the social functioning, or rather non-functioning, of persons with personality disorders, we learn that, although until recently psychiatrists were reluctant to acknowledge it, those with personality disorders are functionally more disabled than the neurotic psychiatrists prefer to treat. The contradictions multiply. First, we are told that people with personality disorders have no bodily disease and do not want to be mental patients, but nevertheless are mentally ill and psychiatric patients. Now we learn that psychiatrists do not like to treat persons suffering from personality disorders, yet these patients are more commonly encountered in psychiatric practice than any others. Moreover, many non-patients also suffer from this malady. Personality disorders account for the most irrational elements among the leaders of society. Then, even before finishing the introduction, the authors offer us the following remarkable passage, completely contradicting claims advanced elsewhere in the book, where they assert that the neuroses are diseases. Those with personality problems are not easy to understand. The neurotic is often a self-diagnosed sinner who willingly begs for psychiatric help, confesses his problems, and often thereby cures himself. In marked contrast, someone with a personality disorder is far more likely to refuse psychiatric help, point out the psychiatrist's problems, and by persisting in his annoying behavior, cause colleagues in other disciplines to scoff at psychiatrists' competence. Virtually all of the issues I have discussed earlier are wonderfully illustrated in these lines. Note, for example, the author's disdain for the neurotic. He is a sinner who begs for help and confesses his problems. It would seem, then, that the neurotic's problems are existential or moral rather than medical or psychiatric. Nevertheless, psychiatrists eagerly embrace him as a sick patient. Note further the author's explicit acknowledgement that persons sick with personality disorders refuse psychiatric help. It is not surprising that the authors find them not easy to understand. They do not want to understand such persons. They want to define them as mentally ill and coerce them into becoming psychiatric patients. Finally, the fact that the person afflicted with a personality disorder wants to stay away from psychiatrists is interpreted as follows. Because those with personality disorders do not routinely acknowledge pain from what society perceives as their symptoms, the person is often regarded as unmotivated for treatment. This is an absurd assertion. The persons the authors here describe are not regarded as unmotivated for treatment. They are unmotivated for it because they simply do not want it. Despite these seeming obstacles to therapeutic cooperation, the authors proceed to a clinical overview of the disease. After having read their introduction, one wonders how they will identify this disease and what rationale they will offer for claiming it as a disease. Personality disorder, they state, is a mental disease with 4 characteristics. The first characteristic is an inflexible and maladaptive response to stress. The second characteristic is a disability in working and loving that is generally more serious and always more pervasive than that found in neurosis. The third characteristic is that personality disorders almost always occur in response to a social context. And the fourth characteristic is a peculiar capacity to get under the skin of others. A remarkable list indeed. The author's suggestion for therapy is even more remarkable. Reliable diagnosis depends on what the psychiatrist can observe with certainty. However, the successful management of patients who insist that nothing is the matter must be based on what he can infer. The authors simply ignore the vexing question of what entitles psychiatrists to regard a person as a patient if he insists that nothing is the matter, and what entitles them to treat such a person against his will. Being incarcerated, the mental hospital patient and the prison inmate. Long before I became a psychiatrist, I was impressed by the fact that in modern societies many individuals are incarcerated like prisoners in institutions, but are called patients. No doubt, others have been impressed by this also. I assume they have dismissed it, however, as a social arrangement justified by medical considerations. I could never believe this. Because of my attention to the role of coercion in psychiatry, my critics have consistently accused me of overemphasizing its importance. I, for my part, feel that psychiatrists underestimate its importance, and for an obvious reason. The social role of the mental hospital patient resembles the role of the prison inmate much more than it resembles the role of the medical patient. Carl Jaspers, who abandoned a successful psychiatric career to become a philosopher, recognized this embarrassing similarity but chose not to pursue it. Admission to hospital, he wrote, often takes place against the will of the patient, and therefore the psychiatrist finds himself in a different relationship to his patient than other doctors. He tries to make the difference as negligible as possible by deliberately emphasizing his purely medical approach to the patient, but the latter in many cases is quite convinced that he is well and resists these medical efforts, emphasis added. Psychiatrists, politicians, and others concerned with mental health policy systematically reject this insight, a denial that immediately derails their efforts to help the persons they insist on calling mentally ill. Moreover, this hypocritical equation of the situation of the mental patient with that of the medical patient obstructs the more relevant and fruitful comparison of the situation of the mental hospital patient with that of the prison inmate. Like criminal behavior, mentally ill behavior is a deviation from psychosocial, that is, conventional, ethical, legal norms of conduct. Like conviction for crime, commitment for mental illness cannot come into being without someone's lodging a complaint about the offender patient, and without that complaint being legitimized by appropriate social authorities. The social anatomy of crime, with and without victims. Lawbreaking is a phenomenon. Law and crime are social constructs. For a crime to exist, there must be a triangular relationship, such as the following. Smith steals Jones' car and wallet in New York, drives to Boston, and lives it up using Jones' credit cards. Jones complains to the police about the theft. The police arrest Smith, and a judge sends him to jail. In short, there is an offender, a victim, and a social authority with legitimacy to validate or invalidate the complaint, and with power to coerce the offender. Although people sometimes naively believe that crime consists simply of lawbreaking, that is not so. A crime can be said to exist only when a person lodges a complaint against another person and when his complaint is formally legitimized as valid. Suppose that Jones does not complain to the police about the loss of his car, perhaps because it contains evidence of his own criminal activity. How would the police know that a crime had been committed? They couldn't. My point here is similar to that of the classic question about a tree falling in a deserted forest. Does it make a sound? The answer is no. It generates sound waves, but not sound, since the term sound refers to that which is heard, Webster's. A similar distinction obtains between law-breaking as an event and crime as a legal concept. This is not hair-splitting. On the contrary, it is a distinction with supremely important practical consequences. As I noted, if a robbery is not reported, there can be no prosecution because there is no suspect. Suppose, however, that the police catch the culprit by accident and charge him with the crime. There may still be no crime unless the victim is willing to testify against the offender. In the practical administration of the criminal law, it is the plainest common sense that even if an accused is in fact guilty, the police may have no case against him if the victim refuses to cooperate with the prosecution. If pressed to testify, all an unwilling witness has to do is say in court, "I don't remember," if that is the man who robbed me or whatever, and the case against the accused collapses. This is one of the reasons why many gangland crimes committed by professional criminals against each other are impossible to prosecute. Typically, then, ordinary crime presupposes two conflicting parties, one asserting that he has been victimized, the other, usually, denying that he is at fault. This is why the concept of so-called victimless crime is inconsistent with Anglo-American legal principles and practices. Suppose, for example, that Jones buys marijuana from Smith. Jones is not, literally, a victim. He has no more grievance against Smith than if Smith were selling him newspapers or candy. Nor has Smith a complaint against Jones. In short, crimes with victims are literal crimes, whereas crimes without victims are metaphorical crimes. Of course, once people literalize their metaphors, religious, legal, or psychiatric, it becomes difficult or impossible for them to see this distinction. Yet the distinction remains and continues to bedevil those who try to treat victimless crimes like ordinary crimes. It must suffice here to indicate a few of the consequences of the literalization of this particular metaphor. Because a metaphorical crime produces no literal victim, a victim is created by legal fiat. It is said to be society. This allows agents of society to create and lodge complaints of such lawbreaking. But how do they know that a law has been broken? By themselves engaging in an unlawful act. For example, an undercover policeman impersonates a John or a drug user and entraps a prostitute or drug seller. Since there is no literally aggrieved party in such a transaction, the policeman lodges the complaint, unless he succumbs to the temptation of extorting a bribe from the prostitute or becoming a drug dealer. The rest is modern American history: organized crime, police corruption, disrespect for law, unprotected streets and homes. The social anatomy of Surlu mental illness. As we distinguish between law-breaking and crime, so we must also distinguish between peculiar behavior and psychosis. A formal diagnosis of psychosis requires the same sort of triangular relationship as does a formal finding of crime. Here is an example. Mr. Jones persecutes his wife with complaints that she is poisoning his food and making him impotent. As long as Mrs. Jones remains silent, or perhaps mentions this only to her timid elderly mother, we cannot properly speak of Mr. Jones as being psychotic. However, once Mrs. Jones goes to the local mental health center and complains about her husband's delusions, she sets in motion a social process that normally ends in Mr. Jones being formally diagnosed and perhaps committed to a mental hospital. Of course, before that happens, there is likely to be a confrontation between Mr. Jones and Mrs. Jones with certain representatives of social authority, social workers, psychiatrists, judges, entering the fray and adjudicating the conflicting claims. How do they do that? On the basis of the evidence presented to them. For example, Mrs. Jones may, in the last minute, withdraw her complaint and volunteer that she has made it up to punish Mr. Jones for his past infidelities, and Mr. Jones may behave in a socially appropriate manner in front of those formally judging his mental state, in which case he would not be committed to a mental hospital. Conversely, Mrs. Jones may stick to her accusations, called giving a history of Mr. Jones's illness, and Mr. Jones may insist that not only is his wife poisoning him, but that she is also a secret KGB agent, and that God has told him he must kill her, in which case he will surely be committed to a mental hospital. The parallels between crime and mental illness could thus hardly be more perfect. In each case, 1. Claimants advance conflicting claims concerning each other and themselves. 2. Representatives of social authority judge the validity of the conflicting claims and decide in favor of one or another party. 3. The person adjudicated as properly accused of crime or mental illness is detained for further investigation, trial, mental examination. 4. If the accused is confirmed in the suspected role, guilty, psychotic, he is incarcerated, in prison or mental hospital. As a rule, the person imprisoned or hospitalized in a mental institution is the individual accused of crime or mental illness. In exceptional cases, however, the accusation can backfire and result in the accusers becoming the accused and ending up incarcerated. This is what happened to Alger Hiss, who was convicted of perjury, not of espionage. And this is what happens in James Thurber's A Unicorn in the Garden, where the nasty but normal wife who tries to commit her harmlessly eccentric husband ends up incarcerated in the booby hatch. In short, a person cannot become a criminal unless and until he is accused of a crime, nor can a person become a committed mental patient unless and until he is accused of mental illness. In both cases, the accusation may be lodged by 1. An aggrieved party, victim or relative, 2. An unaggrieved agent of the state, entrapment by policeman, recommendation by psychiatrist, or 3. The subject himself, criminal seeking conviction confesses to crimes, self-identified mental patient seeking mental hospitalization volunteers psychotic symptoms. However, the situation of the prison inmate and mental hospital inmate differ in the ways in which complaints against them are perceived and adjudicated. Briefly put, Americans see merit in the principle that a person accused of crime should be considered innocent until proven guilty, and that it is better to let 1,000 guilty persons go free than incarcerate a single innocent person. In the case of the person accused of mental illness, Americans see merit in exactly the opposite principle, namely, that such a person should be considered mentally sick until proven otherwise, and that it is better to hospitalize 1,000 persons who do not need treatment than to deprive a single person of the treatment he needs for his mental illness. This is why lawyers who help a person accused of a crime to rebut the charges against him are not considered to be the enemies of the social order, whereas psychiatrists who help a person accused of mental illness to rebut the charges against him are considered to be such enemies, as the following example illustrates. Aim Landers, a staunch advocate of mental health, systematically misidentifies treatment for mental illness as identical to treatment for medical illness. The following is her reply to a letter from a woman who complained about the difficulties facing parents trying to get their mentally sick child to accept psychiatric help. You've honed in on one of the most frustrating aspects of helping a psychotic. It is getting that person to accept treatment. Often a parent must file a complaint to enable the police to force the patient to go to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation, emphasis added. In the case of crime, Miss Landers no doubt distinguishes between a complaint filed with the police and the guilt of the accused, and supports the Anglo-American legal principle that the accused and his agents are entitled to a defense against the accusation. In the case of mental illness, however, her attitude is just the opposite. Well-meaning civil libertarians, she writes, in an effort to protect the rights of the mentally ill, have in some instances prevented such action. In short, Miss Landers views the effort to prevent a person's imprisonment in a mental hospital as unjustified. Her mindless endorsement of psychiatric deception and coercion is dramatically illustrated in the closing lines of her reply. Medication for psychotics unwilling to go to mental hospitals has been a godsend. In the old days, it was a major hassle every 4 hours to get a mental patient to take his medicine. Today, one shot of Prolixin can keep a psychotic under control for approximately 2 weeks. Enormous progress has been made, and it's the drugs that have produced miracles. Medication, miracle drugs, godsend. Clearly, there is no justification here for obstacles to the transformation of American citizens from persons into mental patients. Such is the logic of the psychiatric ideas and interventions endorsed by Miss Landers, and no doubt eagerly accepted by most of her readers. Since at this point the reader might wonder just what is wrong with Miss Landers' recommendations for therapy, her endorsement of the enormous progress that has been made in psychiatry and in general with the way so-called psychiatric problems are now managed in our society, I shall briefly restate my objections to the use of legally recognized excuses, incriminations, and incarcerations based on psychiatric criteria. Simply put, my objections rest on the classic philosophy of individual liberty, according to which it is just to punish a man for what he has done, but it is unjust to do so for what he is or thinks. This is all we mean and can mean high freedom under law. To punish a man, wrote Thomas Macaulay, because he has committed a crime, or because he is believed, though unjustly, to have committed a crime, is not persecution. To punish a man because we infer from the nature of some doctrine which he holds that he will commit a crime is persecution, and is, in every case, foolish and wicked. I submit that what we now call psychosis is either crime or doctrine. That is, it is either an act we should call crime and treat accordingly, or it is what Macaulay called doctrine, and we should treat it accordingly. The modern, psychiatrically enlightened intellectual believes our moral duty is to do exactly the opposite. If a dangerous psychotic commits a crime, we must not punish him, because it would be unjust to do so. Whereas if he is merely dangerous, we must restrain him, because he is ill and it would be uncaring not to do so. This tendency of falling into therapeutic despotism and paternalism must have been apparent to classical liberals. Man, warned Macaulay, is so inconsistent a creature that it is impossible to reason from his belief to his conduct, or from one part of his belief to another. From this flows the principle that we must punish overt acts, not inward mental states. Obviously, once the incarceration of certain classes of persons is accepted as not a loss of liberty, but a gain of treatment, the whole classical liberal argument for individual liberty and responsibility becomes meaningless. But let us return, for a final observation, to our comparison of the criminal and the mental patient. The differences between crime and mental illness are actually the greatest when the subject and the object of a criminal or psychiatric complaint is the same person, the agent himself. When a person lodges a criminal complaint against himself, it is investigated the same way as if someone else had lodged it. For example, when a grisly, unsolved crime is reported by the press, and the police look for the person who did it, innocent people often come forward and confess to the crime. Such a confession is never accepted on its face value as true. On the contrary, it is treated with the utmost skepticism. On the other hand, when a person lodges a psychiatric complaint against himself, it is not investigated at all. When, for example, a man says that the FBI is sending messages to him through his gold teeth, the patient's assertion is accepted on its face value as true. Indeed, psychiatrists view it as a symptom of mental illness when, in fact, it is merely a claim. These considerations explain why pseudoscientific experiments with so-called pseudo-mental patients excite so much interest and why such experiments are worthless. See Chapter 6. Classifying the rule violator. Persons do not become patients, but may become mental patients by breaking the law, being arrested, and then being coerced into the sick role. While this is not the way people discover that they have a duodenal ulcer or leukemia, it is the way they often discover they have schizophrenia or an antisocial personality disorder. The psychiatric diagnoses then obscure why these persons are called patients and why they are confined involuntarily in buildings called hospitals. Mental patient taken to movie escapes reads a typical newspaper headline. Arrested and charged with 16 crimes, including kidnapping, threatening to murder, assault and battery with a deadly weapon, and forcible rape of a child. This offender, instead of being imprisoned to await trial, was sent to a mental hospital for psychiatric examination to determine his competence to stand trial. Automatically, such a person is called a patient. This linguistic habit, reflected in countless similar reports, makes me conclude that American doctors, lawyers, newspapermen, and the American people in general are now perfectly comfortable with the idea that a person such as this malefactor is a mental patient, and that the building in which he is forcibly, but evidently not forcibly enough, confined is a hospital. In other words, they are comfortable with the practice called diverting offenders from the criminal justice system to the mental health system. The result is that the conditions in mental hospitals and prisons, as well as the conditions of the persons incarcerated in them, tend to be similar. This is so familiar that documenting it is like beating the proverbial dead horse. But one will beat it once more, if only for a moment. In June 1985, a Senate committee headed by Senator Lowell P. Weicker, R. Con, released the results of its 6-month-long investigation of state mental hospitals. The committee, whose findings included numerous injuries among patients and staff, severe understaffing, physical abuse of patients, lack of treatment programs, came close to noting that many mental patients are in fact criminals guilty of violence against others, but stopped short of doing so. Now that dangerousness is the only criterion for involuntary hospitalization, and now that new barriers exist to treating patients, hospitals are filling up with dangerous patients who are merely being housed. One maintain, however, that the term dangerous patient is a dangerously misleading way of describing individuals who violate other people's rights to life, liberty, and property. Actually, one of the most important functions of the mental patient role and of the idea of mental illness itself is to obscure certain crimes and the psychiatric methods of dealing or failing to deal with them. The upshot is that people now repress the obvious criminality of violent mental patients in much the same way as in Victorian times they repressed the obvious sexuality of women. However, as Freud warned, the repressed inexorably returns, and when it does, hardly anyone recognizes it for what it really is. The following newspaper story is illustrative. Psychiatric centers fail to report patient crimes. State panel says, reads the headline. But what do the authorities expect? They keep telling people that mental hospital inmates are mad, not bad. How, then, can they be criminals? Easily, as the rest of the report demonstrates. Albany, December 21, 1985, AP. Directors of state psychiatric centers are breaking the law by failing to report possible crimes among patients to the police, a state commission has concluded. At 3 centers in April, there were 136 incidences of suspected assault on patients, 16 of which resulted in major injuries. In one incident withheld from the police, a patient was beaten into semi-consciousness by another patient. There is a perception among facility directors that the police do not vigorously investigate such crimes. The latter observation is a gross understatement. Psychiatrists would have to be crazy to report crimes committed by patients to the police, and they would have to be even crazier to report crimes they themselves commit. Ironically, after insisting that criminals are sick, and after forcibly evicting mental patients from mental hospitals, psychiatrists now criticize the handling of persons they call mental patients by complaining about the criminalization of mentally disordered behavior. Characteristically, psychiatrists who address this subject pretend that the clients served by the criminal and institutional psychiatric systems are the incarcerated inmates rather than those who incarcerate them. From that perspective, they see the situation this way. The finding that substance abuse and antisocial personality disorder are most often ascribed to psychiatrically ill incarcerated offenders supports the assertion that individuals are selectively unable to gain access to treatment. If the forfeited patients continue to be socially disruptive and continue to be excluded from psychiatric facilities, they will readily be accepted by the criminal justice system. The fact that the criminalization of the mentally ill is taking place can be considered a comment on the failure of psychiatry in its association with government, emphasis added. Is it true, however, that what we are witnessing is the criminalization of the mentally ill, as many psychiatrists now contend, or is it instead merely an occasional reversal in the centuries-old process of the psychiatrization of the criminal? As I have tried to show, individuals do not exist in nature, labeled as criminals or mentally ill. What do exist are persons who violate social norms and who are then categorized in various ways. When masses of men, especially the pillars of society, automatically prejudge rule violators as heretics, witches, or mental patients, then we witness one of the most fundamental social mechanisms by means of which groups secure the cohesion of their members, namely scapegoating. The role of the psychiatrist. Since the roles of mental patient and psychiatrist are complementary, there remains for us to see if we can throw more light on the former by illuminating the latter. As we have had occasion to observe already, the psychiatrist's relationship with his patient is not only often paternalistic, like the physician's, but also coercive, quite unlike the physician's. Paternalism, medical and psychiatric, there is a large and largely inadequate body of literature on paternalism in medicine and psychiatry. I am critical of this literature because it is long on self-congratulatory abstractions and short on candid analyses of and clear stands on concrete medico-ethical issues. Sometimes the very definition of paternalism used by writers on medical ethics is unsatisfactory, for example, when it is defined as interfering with the decision of the patient for the sake of benefiting the patient. By omitting the adjective ostensibly before, for the sake of, these writers reveal their deep-seated bias in favor of medical paternalism, which they then proceed to defend as follows. When this medical paternalism occurs with competent patients, so-called strong paternalism occurs. Such paternalism is taken to be unjustified on most accounts in the literature. On this basis, almost all medical care turns out, we believe, to be strongly paternalistic and thus unjustified. However, if this is so, why do patients so readily accept such care? But if all of medicine is unjustifiably paternalistic, then in a strong sense none of it is. This meditation ignores the simple fact that many people, especially when they are ill, want to be treated paternalistically. The crucial question before us is not whether medical paternalism is abstractly justified or unjustified, but whether, in any particular case, it is what both doctor and patient want. If one party wants it and the other does not, there is a conflict between them that often generates another question, namely, is either party resorting to deception or coercion to press his partner into the role performance he wants? Psychiatrists do this formally by legally committing patients and treating them against their will. Patients do it informally by producing emergencies such as suicide attempts. In my opinion, the paramount issue is whether the relationship is consensual or coercive. Whether it is paternalistic dependent or reciprocally respectful is a secondary consideration. Apparently, there is no limit to the arrogant foolishness to which doctors, especially after they take up medical ethics as a hobby, will not go. For example, Edmund Pellegrino and David Thomasma, two prominent medical ethicists, declare that the ethical aim of medicine is to assure and facilitate the patient's moral agency. Medical paternalism, especially the coercive paternalism characteristic of psychiatry, may serve many ends, but assuring and facilitating the patient's moral agency is surely not among them. Daniel X. Friedman, professor of psychiatry at the University of California in Los Angeles and a former president of the APA, goes even further. In his 1982 presidential address to the APA, he declares, "Clearly all physicians attempt to enhance the individual's wishes for optimal self-regulation of functions, both physiologic and psychologic." If that were true, physicians would be angels in a libertarian heaven. But it is not true. It is the very opposite of the truth. For example, Philip Bean, a British social scientist, offers this account of mental hospitalization in England. A GP might call, apparently routinely, but as it turned out, usually as a result of a family member making a secretive visit, and a consultant psychiatrist would subsequently visit. Sometimes the GP would say he is calling in a specialist. Rarely did he say it would be a psychiatrist. The psychiatrists occasionally colluded with this, for they seldom explained to the patient their specialism. Ironically, psychiatrists in Britain pride themselves on the fact that a much lower percentage of mental patients are hospitalized involuntarily in their country than in the United States. The difference may be due to Americans being less submissive to bureaucratic and professional authorities than Britons, or to their being more naive in believing they can effectively resist psychiatric coercion. Why do medical ethicists, psychiatrists, and other physicians distort the nature of the medical and psychiatric enterprise so outrageously? Is it possible that they do so precisely because they, too, feel disturbed by the power thrust upon physicians by the state? But the remedy for having too much power lies in renouncing and rejecting it, not in deluding oneself and others that one uses power solely to make others independent and self-reliant. When has power ever been so used by human beings? The psychiatrist's love affair with coercion. The modern physician, especially the psychiatrist, is, as I have observed earlier, in love with coercion. Illustrative is the headline in American medical news: Team MDs call for mandatory drug tests. The coercers explain, the players' unions are making a big mistake in treating drug rehabilitation not as a treatable medical problem, but as a bargaining chip. But what business do doctors have coercing professional athletes to submit to drug testing? Why don't these malicious meddlers propose coercing their fellow physicians to submit to such testing, or their congressmen and senators? As if it wasn't bad enough to use medical rationalizations to justify depriving persons of the right to decide what substances they may ingest, such rationalizations are now also used to justify depriving persons of the right to reject ingesting substances they do not want. Moreover, as if it wasn't bad enough to subject committed mental patients to such infantilization and mistreatment, psychiatrists now also insist that psychiatric outpatients be compelled to submit to involuntary treatment. Since the 1960s, the legislatures and courts of at least 29 states have approved a policy called outpatient commitment, authorizing psychiatrists to exercise the powers of quasi-therapeutic parole officers, compelling legally competent, unincarcerated persons to submit to psychiatric drugging. Outpatient commitment, explains a report in Psychiatric News, is aimed at chronic mentally ill patients who respond well to medication while in the hospital but stop taking it once they leave. However, I view this phenomenon as evidence that psychiatrists and patients have different criteria for what constitutes responding well to antipsychotic drugs, a heretical interpretation in the eyes of psychiatrists. Moreover, the outpatient commitment process itself is described as being less formal than that for inpatient commitment, patients being ordered to outpatient treatment, emphasis added. I emphasize the word treatment because later in the report we learn that judges are committing patients to outpatient treatment without clinical advice or even against the judgment of the hospital or CMHC, Community Mental Health Center staff. Are psychiatrists who refuse to treat such patients in contempt of court? Need more be said? Perhaps nothing demonstrates the depth of the disjunction between rhetoric and reality in psychiatry as clearly as the fact that while no group of professionals in the United States today protests its paternalistic commitment to being compassionate and wanting to help more loudly than psychiatrists, no group is more reviled by the ostensible beneficiaries of its ministrations. Of course, involuntarily confined mental patients have always complained about the loss of liberty inflicted on them by psychiatrists. However, their traditional protest that they had been falsely committed only served to reinforce the legitimacy of psychiatric incarceration. Their complaint implied that they accepted the standard psychiatric justification for coercion. In other words, as everyone agreed that persons guilty of murder were rightly imprisoned, so everyone, including former mental patients, agreed that persons correctly diagnosed as insane were rightly committed. The fact that former mental patients insisted that they had been incorrectly diagnosed as insane only proved the accuracy of the diagnosis. In the early 1970s, after the publication of The Myth of Mental Illness and the Manufacture of Madness, in which, on epistemological, moral, and political grounds, I rejected the legitimacy of civil commitment and the insanity defense, the protest tactics of former mental hospital patients changed radically. Having overcome their belief in the mythology of mental illness, they began, first of all, to call themselves psychiatric inmates or victims, instead of patients. Moreover, freed of the invalidating identity imposed on them by their adversaries, relatives as well as psychiatrists, they were able to relinquish their defensive identification with their oppressors, and with it the counterproductive claim of "I have been railroaded." Instead, by assuming their rightful identities as responsible moral agents, former mental hospital patients were able to respect themselves and their fellow victims, combine forces with one another, and, like the members of any other special interest group in a free society, assert their right to speak for themselves. The result was that they began to demonstrate regularly against psychiatrists at their professional meetings. A mimeographed leaflet distributed at the 1983 convention of the APA in New York City included this invitation. Come and join us in a day of peaceful protest against the American Psychiatric Association. Each year, hundreds of thousands of Americans are deprived of their human rights by psychiatry. Stop psychiatry, before it stops you. I consider this to be a momentous advance in the struggle to return the so-called mental patient to his full stature as a human being, restored to liberty by being protected from psychiatric imprisonment and torture, and hopefully restored to responsibility by being deprived of the excuse of the insanity defense. Nothing like the demonstration of former psychiatric inmates against psychiatrists happens to other medical specialists. The only similar situations that come to mind are the demonstrations against abortion clinics. However, the anti-abortion demonstrators claim to represent the fetus whose interest in living undeniably conflicts with the pregnant woman's interest in not wanting to give it birth. Most people, regardless of where they stand on this issue, are able to see merit in the claims of both parties. However, when former mental patients demonstrate against involuntary mental hospitalization and treatment, most people are unable or unwilling to see merit in the contentions of those opposed to psychiatric coercions. What psychiatrists do, bridging the gap between rhetoric and reality in psychiatry, would require greater self-disclosure by psychiatrists concerning what they believe and do, and greater candor by non-psychiatrists, especially by members of the media, concerning the performance of all the actors who play a role in the human tragedies we now call mental diseases and psychiatric treatment. For starters, I offer the following classification, not of mental patients, but of psychiatrists. My criterion for classifying them, I might add, is based not on what they may say, but on what they do. A. Psychiatrists in the housing and prison business. 1. Psychiatrists in public mental hospitals, operators of cheap hotels and wardens to the poor and unimportant and their unwanted relatives. 2. Psychiatrists in private mental hospitals, operators of better hotels and wardens to the rich and important and their unwanted relatives. 3. Anti-psychiatrists in counter institutions, operators of flophouses for the poor and unimportant. B. Psychiatrists in the business of drugging. 1. Neuropharmacological psychiatrists, dealers in psychopharmacological. 2. General psychiatrists, dealers in a combination of psychopharmacological and advice regarding life management. C. Psychiatrists in the business of producing brain damage. 1. The lobotomists, dealers in amputating the frontal lobes. 2. The electroshockers, dealers in delivering artificial epilepsy. 3. The insulin coma producers, dealers in insulin overdosage. D. Psychiatrists in the business of conversation and moral guidance. 1. Psychoanalysts, dealers in the cult of Freudianism. 2. Dynamic psychotherapists, dealers in adjustment to the dominant ethic. 3. Psychotherapists of other persuasions, dealers in the principles and practices of various ethical systems. The fallacy of criticizing the harmfulness of certain psychiatric treatment. Psychiatrists have always imposed their currently fashionable interventions on their patients without the patient's consent or against his will, and mental patients, not all of them, but many, have always maintained that what the psychiatrist did was not treatment, but torture. In view of this history, it is hardly surprising that some former mental patients and some psychiatrists who feel guilty about having participated in the somatic treatment of involuntary patients now wage campaigns against certain specific modern psychiatric interventions, especially ECT. Although in my opinion, the contention that lobotomy, ECT, and the major antipsychotic drugs cause brain damage is valid indeed, it seems to me self-evident pushing this opinion on the public is dangerously misleading and clearly counterproductive. The reason for this is that the claim that a particular psychiatric treatment, say ECT, is bad implies first that it is a bona fide treatment, and hence that there is a condition justifiably regarded as mental illness, which it is intended to ameliorate or cure. Second, that although this particular treatment may be bad, some other treatment might not be. All this is grist for the mill of conventional psychiatry. Obviously, psychiatrists can generate evidence for the beneficial effects of, say, ECT much faster than the ostensible critics of psychiatry can generate evidence for its detrimental effects. Moreover, this line of argument makes it easy for psychiatrists to abandon the criticized intervention in favor of a newer method, and then claim further advances in their therapeutic powers, as they have done, for example, by substituting antidepressant drugs for ECT. Worst of all, the argument about the ineffectiveness or dangerousness of one or another psychiatric treatment distracts attention from, and indeed undermines, what I consider to be the two most valid objections against contemporary psychiatric interventions. First, that in the absence of literal illness, there can be no literal treatment. In other words, there is, and can be, no such thing as a mental or psychiatric treatment. And second, that without informed and uncoerced consent by the patient, no medical or psychiatric intervention is justified, while with consent every such intervention is justified, even if there is no illness and even if the intervention is considered to be harmful by its critics, provided that the procedure does not injure innocent third parties. In short, by dwelling on the deleteriousness of ECT or neuroleptic drugs, the ostensible critics of psychiatry try to beat psychiatrists at their own game and on their own grounds. In the process, the critics neglect to use their strongest weapon, namely, insisting that the controversy is not about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of any particular psychiatric intervention, but about consent versus coercion. In other words, that as I have indicated, with consent, even ineffective or worthless treatments ought to be permitted, whereas without it, even treatments officially deemed effective ought not to be. Unfortunately, in their zeal to combat psychiatry, and especially certain brutal interventions, many would-be critics of psychiatry espouse the same intolerance and coerciveness toward those who disagree with them as do their psychiatric adversaries. Finally, I want to re-emphasize the obvious, namely, that people are both similar to and different from one another. It is human diversity, or perversity, that accounts for two stubborn facts, one upsetting to psychiatrists, the other to the critics of somatic treatments. The first is that, regardless of how beneficial certain interventions might be according to psychiatrists, some mental patients will consider them to be harmful and reject them. This upsets the psychiatrists who want to force the patients to submit to their care and cure. The other is that, regardless of how harmful and brain-damaging certain somatic treatments might be according to their critics, some persons will eagerly seek out such treatments and will willingly submit to them. This upsets the critics who want to coerce both psychiatrists and patients to refrain from engaging in certain consensual treatment relationships. Respect for the liberty and responsibility of mental patients and psychiatrists requires that we eschew both of these postures and look to a mechanism such as the psychiatric will to enhance the autonomy of all the agents participating in TIDS drama. However, so long as most people, including psychiatrists, anti-psychiatrists, and psychiatric patients, prefer coercive to contractual relations, there is no reason to expect such a peaceful resolution of the problem. Paternism and coercion reconsidered. The relationship between patient and physician is typically cooperative. The patient wants to get treatment, and the physician wants to give it. By contrast, the relationship between the mental patient and the psychiatrist is typically antagonistic. The patient wants to engage in certain kinds of behavior, and the psychiatrist wants to prevent him from doing so. Lest this seem an exaggeration, let me say only that my construction follows inexorably from taking commitment statutes seriously. With monotonous regularity, such statutes focus and have always focused on the patient's alleged dangerousness to himself and/or others. Clearly, then, the seriously ill mental patient is a person who is, or is considered to be, dangerous, and the institutional psychiatrist is a person who tries to cure or control the patient's dangerousness. Thus, one of the most obvious differences between the medical and psychiatric situations is that the physician controls diseases, not persons, whereas the psychiatrist controls persons, not diseases. This, of course, is an aphorism, not an assertion. And an aphorism, as the Austrian aphorist Karl Kraus noted, is either a half-truth or a truth and a half, which one the reader must decide. Let me add only that so far as the physician's role is concerned, he cannot, strictly speaking, ever treat a disease without taking cognizance of the person who has it. However, in a medical situation that is at once ideally cooperative and technicalized, by treating the patient's disease, the physician also treats the patient. In contrast, since there is no mental disease, the psychiatrist can never treat the patient's disease. However, in a psychiatrist mental patient situation that is at once ideally coercive and technicalized, by pretending to treat the patient's fictitious disease, the psychiatrist also controls the patient. But let us return to the medical situation. As everyone knows, until the post-World War I years, the typical American physician was a privately practicing professional, whereas the typical American psychiatrist was a state-employed bureaucrat. After the Second World War, physicians began to enter into a progressively more intimate alliance with the state, gradually exchanging their roles as healers for those of employees of medical bureaucracies or agencies of the state. As a result, doctors now seem completely blind to the fundamental distinction between constructing a scientifically defined and justified criterion of health and coercing a person to adopt a lifestyle that promotes his health. The analogy between health and gold may again help to make this point clear. Let us assume, as scientifically proven, that smoking cigarettes and a diet high in cholesterol are conducive to atherosclerosis. Those are then facts, just as the atomic weight or chemical properties of gold are facts. Whether a person in possession of such information accepts or rejects a medically healthy lifestyle, and whether physicians and the state play a role in directly or indirectly forcing a person to adhere to such a lifestyle, are, however, matters not of science but of ethics or politics. Obviously, the state could employ and empower chemists to force people to adopt one or another kind of economic attitude toward gold, and, given sufficient monetary or political rewards, there would be no shortage of chemists willing and eager to play such a role. But no chemist today would think that such a hypothetical chemist coercing his fellow citizens would be anything other than an agent of the state. Nevertheless, physicians think of themselves as scientists and want to be so regarded by the public. Actually, aided and abetted by a health-obsessed society, physicians now act as if knowing what health is and what impairs it would give them a special right to interfere with people's right or free will to choose to be unhealthy. A situation illustrating that, regardless of how scientific his medical methods may be, the modern physician has virtually no sense of, and does not value, the ethics of science as truth-finding and truth-telling. I am not saying here that science is better or worse than religion or politics. That is not the point. The point is that they are different, and that insofar as the scientist uses his knowledge to justify, and indeed to engage in, coercion, he becomes, conceptually and morally, indistinguishable from the inquisitor or dictator. After all, not so long ago, the priest, having defined heaven and hell, knew all about them. Accordingly, the priest believed, and people agreed, that he was entitled to coerce individuals to live so that they maximize their chances of going to heaven and minimize their chances of going to hell. Regrettably, the lofty goal called heaven sometimes required killing people, a clerical measure warmly endorsed by the theologians. Today, doctors threaten and coerce people so as to make them healthy and live as long as possible. Since many people refuse to cooperate with the doctor's health rules, the physician feels justified, and the people agree that he is entitled to spoil their pleasures by intimidating and torturing them. Regrettably, the lofty goal called health often requires making people mentally sick, a clinical measure warmly endorsed by physicians. By this I mean inventing mental illness terms and attaching them to certain patterns of unwanted behaviors. See Chapter 3. Doctors and patients have come a long way since the 19th century, but we had better think twice before we conclude it has all been progress. It is of more than passing interest to note, in this connection, one of the definitions of the word profession in the Oxford English Dictionary. A profession in our country, wrote a British gentleman named Maurice in 1829, is expressly that kind of business which deals primarily with men as men, and is thus distinguished from a trade which provides for the external wants or occasions of men. Until recently, this criterion applied particularly to the practice of medicine and law, the relations between practitioners and their clients being based on mutual respect and trust, and of course, the studied avoidance of coercion. Since psychiatrists do not deal with men as men, but on the contrary, deal with men as madmen, psychiatry fails, by this criterion, to qualify as a profession. Although Maurice's definition of a profession may now strike us as quaint and old-fashioned, it should serve as a reminder of how radically the meaning of the word profession has changed since the 19th century. Formerly, the professional was a person who had a personal relationship with his clients based on mutual respect and reciprocity. Today, the professional is a person who has an impersonal relationship with his clients based on his superior and their inferior competence in a specialized area of knowledge or skill. The psychiatrist and the mental patient as adversaries. An important feature of legitimate power is that its very existence induces people to submit to it voluntarily, that is, because they believe that the behavior prescribed is right, or because they fear punishment for deviating from it. Thus, most people subject to taxation or traffic laws willingly pay their taxes and obey the rules of the road. Similarly, most people subject to mental health laws voluntarily consent to mental hospitalization. This is why the standard psychiatric argument that since only a minority of the persons in mental hospitals is detained involuntarily, involuntary mental hospitalization is not an important issue, is specious and unpersuasive. Actually, so long as incarceration in a mental hospital is a legally legitimate and socially approved procedure, we cannot meaningfully speak of anyone entering or remaining in a mental hospital voluntarily. We must keep this always in mind when we consider the controversy concerning commitment and other coerced psychiatric interventions. Although official psychiatric rhetoric conceals the frequently antagonistic relationship between psychiatrist and mental patient, informal psychiatric publications, the so-called throwaway journals, allow us to see things as they are. The following excerpt, entitled "Types of Problem Patients on a Locked Unit," comes from such a source. Presumably, if the patient were cooperative, he would not have been admitted or transferred to the locked units to begin with. The most frequent problem encountered is the patient who refuses to do whatever it is we think he should do. Some patients start right out refusing to talk, a rather perplexing problem for a new intern who just finished a course in history taking and sits expectantly, pen in hand, only to be greeted by a stony silence. Other refusals, not necessarily in order of either importance or frequency, include refusal of medication, refusal to sign consent for electroconvulsive therapy, refusal to go for electroconvulsive therapy after signing the consent, refusal to attend activities, and ultimately refusal to accept discharge plans. Why do psychiatrists systematically impose themselves on persons who want to have nothing to do with them? I believe they do so because, like most people, psychiatrists love power and exult in pushing others around. "We must take a stand," declares H. Richard Lamb, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Southern California, for involuntary treatment, both acute and ongoing. Such interventions should not be limited to those who can be proven to be dangerous. Similar statements abound in the psychiatric literature. Yet, when they are criticized for using coercive methods, psychiatrists often defend themselves by claiming that they dislike treating patients against their will and do it only out of a deep sense of civic and moral duty. However, that is patently untrue, as the whole history of psychiatry proves. Nor, in this connection, must we overlook the fact that the role of psychiatrist, like that of mental patient, is entirely voluntary. No one in the United States is forced to become a physician. No physician is forced to become trained as a psychiatrist. No one so trained is forced to practice conventional psychiatry. Accordingly, if a psychiatrist engages in the manufacture of involuntary mental patients either through the mechanism of civil commitment or through the mechanism of the insanity defense, then he proves by his actions that he enjoys being a coercive paternalist. Indeed, so passionately convinced are psychiatrists about the rightfulness of treating patients against their will that they contemptuously denounce those remaining few who refuse to treat involuntary patients. Such psychiatrists, say the coercers, reject treating the sick, avoid the most difficult cases, and are unworthy of being psychiatrists. Be that as it may, distinguishing between paternalism and coercion allows us to lay to rest, once and for all, the claim that, because both medical and psychiatric practices tend to be paternalistic, the differences between them are negligible. In addition, it allows us to identify the various combinations of these two elements and thus reaffirm the crucial differences between caring for patients, coercing mental patients, and confining prisoners. The medical situation may be paternalistic or non-paternalistic, but cannot be coercive. The psychiatric situation may be paternalistic or non-paternalistic, and in addition may be coercive as well. Coercion without paternalism characterizes the relationship between a decent jailer and his civilized prisoner. See Table 4.2. Table 4.2. Paternalism and coercion, treatment, coercion, contract. Nature and name of medical relationship. Paternalism with coercion, most medical interventions vis-a-vis children, all involuntary psychiatric interventions, called involuntary treatment. Paternalism without coercion, medical and voluntary psychiatric interventions vis-a-vis consenting clients, treated as if they were dependents rather than partners, called voluntary treatment. Coercion without paternalism, civilized penal sanctions, the lawful punishing of lawbreakers without condescension, called punishment, fine, probation, prison sentence. Neither paternalism nor coercion, giving and receiving help based on mutual respect between responsible adults, called contract, help, therapy, treatment. Sadly, however, a persistent professional and popular unwillingness to recognize that mental patients are persons first and patients second, coupled with a stubborn refusal to treat them as persons rather than as mental patients, vitiates all current efforts, sincere or otherwise, to help them. We recognize that a person considered to be sick is a person first and a patient second. If such a person chooses not to be a patient, no one says that he rejects treatment precisely because of his illness. However, if a person considered to be mentally sick wants to reject treatment, that is exactly what most people say. Politicians are no exception. Witness New York City Mayor Ed Koch's comment that a person who is mentally ill often resists treatment precisely because of his illness. This image is completely out of focus. Mayor Koch's remark reflects the distortion built into our picture of psychiatry. Like his constituency, the mayor views treatment accorded the involuntary mental patient as a psychiatric or mental health service. But the term service implies not only that it is something provided for the recipient, but also that the recipient has the option to reject it. Normally, saying that a person is receiving services involuntarily, for example, from an electric utility company, would be a clear case of talking nonsense. In such a context, the term involuntary service is an oxymoron. Only in relation to the involuntary mental patient do we speak of his receiving services and accept the locution as legitimate. This, perhaps, is the most important evidence of how mercilessly we infantilize him.